Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the August 4th, 2008 meeting of the Joint Meeting of the Town Council Redevelopment Agency and Parking Authority. Welcome back to all of you and to us from our summer break. And I will now ask Madam Clerk, first of all, welcome her back from her honeymoon and ask her to take the roll.
Councilmember Steve Glickman.
Here.
Councilmember Diane McNutt.
Here.
Councilmember Joe Przinski.
Here.
Vice Mayor Mike Wasserman.
Here.
Mayor and Chair Barbara Spector.
Here. At this point on our agenda, we always ask a future leader to lead our Pledge of Allegiance. And tonight I'm going to ask Olivia Fleshig to move forward here, and I'm going to talk about her for a while. And am I saying it right, Fleshig? Flexig. Okay. Well, I'll do as best I can. Or maybe I'll do it, Olivia. Tonight's future leader is Olivia Flexig, who will be in 8th grade at Fisher Middle School this September. Last year, Olivia had a 4.0 GPA, was a member of the Fisher Leadership Class, and served as student body president. Olivia was recently recognized in the Los Gatos Weekly for her community service work with the American Red Cross Bear Hug Program, a fundraiser to support U.S. military troops. Olivia and other students raised $750, and for every dollar donation, a 5-inch bear would be delivered to members of the armed forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, or in a veterans hospital. Olivia is also an active animal volunteer and has worked at adoption fairs to find homes for abandoned dogs due to Hurricane Katrina. Other interesting facts about Olivia are that she loves to sing and act and participated in Fisher Middle School's last 2 musicals. Olivia also takes private Mandarin Chinese lessons. Olivia would like to become a doctor and loves animals with a passion. And I just found out 1 second ago that she has climbed the Great Wall of China twice. So let's give her a round of applause. I would now ask everybody to stand, and Olivia will lead us in the salute to the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And if I may ask you to come over here, so we all get to meet you. Thank you very much, and hold on just a minute. Thank you. Thank you, and I know you have friends and relatives here with you, and so congratulations to all of you. She's a wonderful young woman. I will now look to Mr. Korb for our closed session report.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council, members of the public. Council did meet in closed session tonight with the town manager. This was with regard to, it's under the heading of Conference with Labor Negotiator, and it's with regard to management. Direction was given to the town manager as labor negotiator. No final reportable actions were taken, and that concludes my report.
Thank you. I will remind everyone that if you intend to speak this evening on any item, please submit to the clerk a card like this. Thank you. We are now on the consent items, which will be acted upon in a single motion unless someone from the council or from the audience pulls an item from the consent calendar. I will advise everybody that items 1 and 10 have been pulled from the consent calendar by Citizen Ray. They will be heard following other business. Does anybody from the council wish to pull any other item? Ms. McNutt?
Number 11, please.
All right, number 11, which will, with the others, be heard after other business. Mr. Glickman.
Yes, let me direct a question to our town attorney. Under item number 4, I would like the council to consider support or, in fact, opposition of another state ballot measure. Would it be appropriate for me to do that under item 4 or to do it under council comment?
Council comment would be the appropriate place.
Thank you.
All right, so if I'm doing this correctly, we have number 1, 10, and 11 pulled from the consent calendar. Anyone from the audience other than Citizen Ray wishing to pull another item from the consent calendar? Seeing no one, may I have a motion? Mr. Brzezinski.
Madam Mayor, I move to approve the consent calendar, last items 1, 10, and 11.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Brzezinski, seconded by Mr. Wasserman to approve the consent calendar other than items 1, 10, and 11. Discussion? Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. All right, verbal communications. And again, anyone wishing to speak on verbal communications or any item should be submitting a card. I have 2 cards under verbal communications. The first one, Mariam Hassani. If you'll please come up here to the podium, give us your name, and then you will have 3 minutes to speak.
My name is Mariam Hassani, and I'm here with some friends and neighbors to address an existing parking problem on Villa Avenue in Los Gatos. It is between 194 Villa Avenue to 174 Villa Avenue in Los Gatos. We represent 100% of the residents of the single-family homes in this section, and all of us are troubled with parking-related issues on Villa Avenue. The parking regulations, as they exist now, are no longer effective, hence they have become a huge burden on us as residents as well as the law enforcement officers. We would like to meet with the Park and Transportation Commission at the next meeting in order to voice our concern and our requests. Now, if you'd like, I could quickly mention some of the problems we have. Otherwise, I could just...
You have 3 minutes to use it if you like.
Some of the existing problems are lack of parking for the homeowners, lack of sufficient parking for the fire department, littering and loitering by the high school students, drug dealing catered to the high school students, drunk drivers after the concerts, rude and aggressive drivers visiting the concerts, rude and aggressive high school students, beauty salon employees, and finally us as homeowners who pay a high amount of taxes, and we nearly have no parking, and we rely on the parking on the street. We do pay for 2 permits yearly, and finally, there is only one officer actually enforcing all of the above. So in result, what we want to ask for is perhaps tailor a parking regulation that would fit to the needs of the tax-paying residents and reduce the workload of the law enforcement officers. So there is actually no need to have inefficient and ineffective parking regulations to harbor the existing problems. That's all we ask for.
All right, thank you. Don't leave yet. I'm going to ask you a question, and then other people might also, and then I'm going to ask a question of staff. When you talked about the various things that impacted your street, you mentioned concerts. Were these high school concerts, town concerts?
Town concerts and also high school events.
Okay. All right. And if I might look to staff, it sounded as though Ms. Hassani was asking about appearing before the Parking Commission.
Yes.
And can you tell her when those meetings would be and if there's anything else you recommend?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, Greg Larson, the town manager. I will ask our Director of Parks and Public Works, Todd Capurso, to meet with you as soon as you leave the microphone to give you the schedule of meetings for the Parks and Public Works Commission. I did also want to inform the council that I've directed the police chief to coordinate town-wide, working with multiple departments, including Parks and Public Works. I think will include community services now, given the concern about concerts, as well as community development about zoning issues, to look at parking throughout the Main Street area. We're in discussions with the high school and other neighborhoods about parking impacts locally. There's no easy solution that doesn't just move the problem around, but we're going to try to find the maximum solution. So you'll also be contacted by the police department to become involved in their discussions on a townwide parking solution.
That's good.
Thank you, Mr. Larson, and thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Glickman.
Thank you. I'd also suggest that the town manager might want to work with the youth commission concerning parking difficulties with the high school community. Thank you.
Thank you. We've started that discussion with the administration, and we certainly will with the youth as well.
All right, seeing no other hands, once again, I thank you very much. The next person who has submitted a card, and the only card I have left on this, is Citizen Ray.
Never mind bringing up the rear. A perfect position. First off, I want to comment on our brand-new Public Works Director. Where is he? Where is that wonderful man? Todd Capurso. There he is. He walked in just in time. Way to go, Todd. And what I'm so impressed with Todd about is I called in 3 days ago, about a vicious chuck hole on Highway 9, right in front of Double D's. And guess what? Within 2 days, that chuck hole was filled. Wow! Am I impressed? So we're looking forward to good things from Mr. Capurso. Number 2. 2 Sundays ago, I was sitting in the park listening to the Glenn Miller group, okay? And there was a dear lady there that she and I struck up a conversation. Turns out she's been in Los Gatos for 50 years. And 25 years ago, she was on the Art Commission. And we chatted and chatted, and finally she made the statement how much she appreciated what I try to do down here as a public interest person, okay? She says historically in Los Gatos, when people like you, and she pointed at me, show up, they get squashed by the town council. That was the word she used, squashed. And I said to myself, wow, maybe that explains why there are no homeowner associations in Los Gatos. 30,000 people in Los Gatos and not one single homeowner organization. Why? I think I know now why. They get squashed and nobody pays any attention. Lastly, on DeSantis, oh, what an ugly situation, okay? 3 members of the town council, Krasinski, McNutt, and Slickman-Glickman, voted to ignore all our mountainside, hillside design guidelines and breached the public trust and approved it. So I, tonight, am going to officially, because of your almost like a mobster approach when you breach the trust, okay, I'm going to give each one of you a nickname. We've got Slickman-Glickman, we got
Thank you.
Nick Lump here, and we got
Thank you.
Madam Josephine Przezinski, who runs the best bordello west of the
Thank you,
Mississippi.
Citizen Ray. Your time is up.
And I'll see you again.
I have no other cards for verbal communications. Seeing no one coming forward, we will now go on to public hearings. And I am, again, asking folks to turn in cards if they intend to speak on either of the public hearings. I have 1 card for item 13. I have no cards for item 14. And that being the case, I am going to move item 14 forward. So we will now have a public hearing on abatement of hazardous vegetation weeds. A, conduct public hearing to consider the report of the County Agricultural Commissioner on the abatement of hazardous vegetation weeds for the 2007-2008 season, and B, adopt resolution approving said report. Let me first ask staff if they have anything to add.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Todd Capurso, Director of Parks and Public Works. I'd like to recognize, I'm sure I'll get the last name wrong, but it's Mo Kumri from the Department of Agriculture and Resource Management with the County of Santa Clara to help us answer questions on this issue as well. Nothing to add to the report, by the way.
All right, nothing to add to the report. Do we have any questions? Mr. Glickman.
Thank you. I'll direct it at either of the two gentlemen who might wish to answer it. It appears from the report that we are enforcing the rules and regulations as they stand, and I'm pleased to hear that. We've had some very frightening fires very close to town. So my question to either one or both of you is, in your best professional opinion, are the current rules, regulations, and requirements sufficient to protect the town? Or should we be looking at something more extensive, given the fact that it's getting drier and drier and scarier and scarier?
All right, I'm going to, why don't you introduce yourself, and I will give you the first opportunity to respond, and Mr. Capurso, if you have anything to add.
Yes, my name is Mo Cumry. I'm the Weed Abatement Coordinator for the Department of Agriculture for the County of Santa Clara. And I perform the weed abatement process for the town of Los Gatos. The standards that are currently exist were actually set up by the state and local fire marshal. They seem to, they are and should be sufficient for the areas around town. If we were to move into a higher fire area, there are standards that would be even greater, asking for, instead of a 30-foot clearance, a 100-foot clearance. Most of the town limits of Los Gatos wouldn't require that, and should be very well protected. I would say that for this town, the program started out this year with 122 properties on the list for monitoring. Of that, we only had to order work on 40, and of that, we only had to perform work on 5. That means 96% of the people within the town's jurisdiction performed their own abatement and didn't need intervention by the county. So that's actually quite good. If everybody does that, if we keep it at 96%, the likelihood of a devastating fire spreading from one parcel to another is not very likely.
Mr. Capurso, do you want to add to that?
I have nothing to add other than to say that is that's a relatively high compliance rate based on my other experience. So I would concur with that. 96% is very high.
Other questions for either gentleman? All right, thank you. Is there anyone else from the audience who wishes to address us on this item? I do not have any cards. Seeing no one coming forward, I will close the public portion of this testimony and this hearing and look to the council for a motion.
I'll move adoption of resolution approving the commencement report.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Glickman, seconded by Ms. McNutt to adopt the resolution attachment 1. Discussion. Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. I'll go back to item 13, update and merge the pre-1941 design guidelines and the residential development standards for all single-family and two-family dwellings in all zones, except the resource conservation and the hillside residential zones. Introduce ordinances amending zoning code consistent with design guidelines. This has been continued from 6/16/08. Zoning ordinance amendment A0801, historic district designation applications HD0801, HD0802, HD0803, and D0804, applicant Town of Los Gatos. And all of that being said, do we have a report from staff? Mr. Larson.
First, members of the mayor and the council, an apology to the viewing public. We are converting to a new audio-visual system in the chambers, and unfortunately, I do not believe the PowerPoint slides, there's a couple of them, will be visible on TV. They are visible, obviously, in the chambers, and this will be corrected by September.
Thank you. Now, do we have a report from staff on this item? Yes, we do. Mr. Lutz.
I was going to say that I have nothing to add to the report, but for some reason I just don't think that'll work. It is my pleasure to bring to you the residential design guidelines that have been in work for the last 3 years. It was about 23 years ago that I wrote the current residential design guidelines that are about 7 pages, and now we're at 89. So we've expanded on them a bit. This discussion does include the update of the residential design guidelines, including town code amendments and historic district ordinance amendments. The document was prepared by staff and the Canon Design Group, has been reviewed extensively by the General Plan Committee and Historic Preservation Committee, and has been recommended for approval by both bodies, has also been reviewed by the Planning Commission on a couple of occasions, and has been recommended approval by that body. Planning Commission did include some changes that they had suggested, which are included in the staff report in some detail. I'll just highlight the changes that the Planning Commission had recommended, with comments on 2. First, on the fencing for wildlife corridors, the Planning Commission suggested using the hillside design guidelines or incorporating the fencing criteria that are included in the hillside design guidelines. Staff does not recommend including that reference. The reason being is that the remainder of the town, the non-hillside areas, have a very wide variety of different kinds of fence types, and hillside type fencing doesn't lend itself to most of the what we call the flatter areas of Los Gatos. I think there is a need at some point in the future for a review of whether we should have a fence ordinance. What people have to understand is that when you go through the design process on a home and you're regulated in terms of what type of fencing you can have, that once the project receives final occupancy, the rules of the zone apply, which means that you can put a fence up at the property line for, in most cases, 6 feet tall. So even in the hillsides, once a split rail fence, for example, is put at the property line and somebody gets occupancy, they could come back in with a chain link fence under the rules of the zone and disturb wildlife corridors or affect the aesthetics. So that is a topic of discussion that I'd like to be bringing up with the general plan update, and look at whether we need a more comprehensive fence ordinance. The challenge is that that would mean there'd be a permit process on fences in town, and right now there is no ordinance requirement for any type of permit for fencing. It's a big topic of discussion. The other more minor changes that the committee, that the Planning Commission had recommended, was to reorder the bullets, incorporated some landscaping language, discussed privacy in the rear yards, neighborhood patterns and types were included, sustainability, a big topic of discussion, was included. The seller language that was recommended by the Planning Commission is included but was revised by staff slightly, but the substance of the Planning Commission's modifications are included. Protection of single-story houses also included. Photograph illustration corrections have been made or will be made. There was some discussion about architectural copper, fences in the front setbacks, and then the last two are additions regarding accessory buildings and second units, and then finally floor area ratio text. Those are the changes that are discussed in detail in the staff report, and all but one was included in substance by staff in the staff report. Some other subsequent changes or revisions that have been discussed in the staff report include building design, and one of the things that I wanted to highlight is Los Gatos. One of the things that we celebrate about this community is the diversity. It is very eclectic, and so it's important to keep that in mind as we look at design standards that get too restrictive and not respectful of the diversity that we call Los Gatos. So on the building design item, we have included some language about the multitude of architectural styles and diversity in Los Gatos neighborhoods to respect that. And so some language is included in that first item on page 9 that is respectful of Los Gatos diversity. The second has to do with the definition of neighborhood and recognizing, again, the diversity of the town, giving primary emphasis on the 2-2-5 approach, but also being respectful of the broader neighborhood that is included in the surrounding area. So some language has been added to address that issue. Then the third has to do with identifiable neighborhoods, just having to do with being a little bit more inclusive about the outlying areas of Los Gatos, which are, of course, just as important to the greater Los Gatos, and referencing the Bellwood neighborhood and the Quito Road neighborhood. And then in terms of setbacks, again, this hits this variety issue. So what we're trying to do there is add some language that provides for variety in terms of the setback pattern. The fifth has to do with mass and scale, and we saw this on a recent application where the mass and scale of a structure can be significantly changed by detaching the garage, setting it into the rear yard, and then in that case, the square footage of the home may be respectful of the neighborhood if you detach the garage from the primary residence, providing that's respectful of the neighborhood and repetitious of the neighborhood context where other garages are detached. The sixth item has to do with solar, and just indicating that, of course, as we all know, the town supports the alternative energy sources, and mentions that advisory guidelines are included to reduce the potential visual impacts. And then the seventh item has to do with exterior lighting, trying to get down lighting so that no bulbs are actually visible. And then finally, to provide continuity through the document, referencing deciding body as opposed to just either planning commission staff or council, as is the case in the current document. That concludes staff's report. We're certainly here to answer any questions you may have. The one thing that I might mention in closure is that the ordinance amendments that are included in the actions to implement the residential design standards follow the adoption of the residential design standards as a sequence. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from Mr. Lortz? Mr. Glickman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Lortz, for, as usual, an excellent report. In looking at page 5 of your report, that's item number 4 on privacy of rear. I'm sorry, Item number 5, neighborhood patterns and types. There's some wording here that I'm guessing that this was either the Planning or the Historic Preservation Commission proposed some changes of language. What I'm struggling with is that the sentence here says, quote, the emphasis is on, quote, neighborhood compatibility, end quote, with the recognition that some change is inevitable and, now the original word was desirable, and apparently there's a suggested change to take out desirable and replace it with may be an improvement to the existing structure and or neighborhood. So my first question is, where did that change come from?
Planning Commission.
Planning Commission. I struggle with that, and it goes along with the issue that you raised a moment ago about trying not to be too restrictive. If I look at pages both 5 and 13 of the design guidelines proposed themselves, we talk about welcoming change. So I'm not totally comfortable with removing the word desirable. I think maybe we might want to replace the word with welcome and followed by an and followed by that language. Now, would your department have a problem with that?
No.
Good. Okay. Next, on same page, number 6, going on to page 6, speaking about renewable energy resources, and in all 3 paragraphs ends with the words, where possible. Since these rules that we approve end up being gone over with a fine-tooth comb during the appeals process or the application process, the words matter. So I would wonder whether you would have any problem with replacing those 3 possibles with the word appropriate. Because to say that where possible means whether it's a good idea or not, you have to do it if you can. And it would seem to me more appropriate to say do it where it's appropriate to do and indicated. Would you have a problem with that?
That would be a welcome change.
Thank you. Going to page 6, it's minor, but it isn't that minor. The 4th bullet says, provide a list of various sources for green building information and their websites. And then you list a bunch of websites, including one that's in the staff report. Websites come and go. So I would think that it's more appropriate to say a list of current websites, which no doubt your department will take responsibility for keeping current, if you have no problem with that.
Don't have a problem with that at all.
Okay. Number 7, I have so many disagreements with that I'm not sure that I want to do it under staff report, maybe under general discussion, so I think I'll leave that one.
Thank you. Mr. Lortz.
Just one comment that may come up through the discussion is that the outreach. This effort has been underway for about 3 years, and after about the first year, we have a rough draft which we shared with pretty much every applicant and every architect that came through the process, and we've been doing that over the last couple of years. We actually sent the document or a letter indicating where they can get the document to well over 20 local architects, and including the American Institute of Architects Santa Clara County chapter, the surrounding cities, and we also had indicated that it was available on our website and What's New. And we were testing it against not only architects but also non-architects, applicants who are homeowners, to see how they would respond to it. And this document reflects changes that were offered throughout the process by those individuals that chose to offer some input. Thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Lortz? Ms. McNutt.
Thank you. I really appreciate the language that you have proposed on page 10
that talks about, especially those related to definition of neighborhood and identifiable neighborhoods and setbacks and so on. You described it as a solution to perhaps the draft appearing to be too restrictive. And I wouldn't use the word restrictive. I would use the word potentially problematic, because when you look at the charts on the residential design guideline, page 11, for example, which is a picture of a standard subdivision, street down the middle, houses directly across from one another, each parcel the same. It's so clean and easy, and I think there are probably 2 streets in all of Los Gatos that look anything close to this. So our streets, and we see this over and over and over again in projects that come forward, our neighborhoods, I mean, you described it as eclectic, but it's not even in architectural style. Parcel sizes can vary so dramatically. Topography is a huge impact in this community. One house is up, one's down, and so on. So I think it's very important that that we incorporate your suggested language into the final document, to acknowledge that and to give both the residents and the architects and the deciding bodies as they go through the process the framework so that they can look at what's real in our community and not at a scheme that doesn't really apply here. I do have 2 questions or suggestions for modification, and that is on, again, on your staff report, page 10, on your item number 2 on definition of neighborhood. And part of the proposed language says, these factors include but are not limited to location and visibility of the building, e.g. terrain of the lot and lots with multiple frontages. And I wonder if we could also include, the other one I thought of is diversity in parcel size, where you can have parcels that, a house could have a 5,000 lot on its right and a half an acre lot on its left, which of course would be my house. Something that we see that all over as another example. And the same thing on number 4 on setbacks, if there could be such as, and a couple of examples added there, just to give some more description and clarity to the folks who are going to be using this document in the future as they're applying it to specific projects. I think that would be very helpful. I think what I'm going to step in now and do before we have any more questions is that there had been a suggestion, if we look at what the staff is asking us to do with regard to all the motions, there had been a suggestion that we make an omnibus motion that just accepts everything that the staff is recommending. And then if anybody wants to take exception, we make motions to amend. I already can tell that that's not going to be a reasonable way to go. And so I know a lot of you are asking staff if things are acceptable to them or if it's okay with them, but is giving you various degrees of affirmation from okay to great. And so what I think the council should keep in mind is the way I'm going to suggest we approach it at the end of the hearing is we may need to actually go through some individual motions on some of these items, because there may be too many just to do it all at one time. All right, that being said, any other questions? Mr. Brzezinski.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Lortz, you referenced in the letter received from the Office of Historic Preservation, and the office commended us, as you pointed out, on our best practices in the historic component. But it also referenced the question of our 1941 guideline and spoke to the issue of a 50-year framework, indicating that when the language of the historic guidelines, when the language was developed, it was developed in 1990, And so the assumption on the state's part was that we backed up 50 years and came up with 1941. And the question is, and it's surfaced since that time, should we not consider a movable historic date versus a fixed date? Because as the office pointed out, at a certain point, there's nothing younger than 70 years that's then considered. Would you comment to that, and whether or not, because I didn't notice anything in the report itself that responded to that particular request, and if you have on your future agenda the consideration of that particular recommendation?
The pre-1941 date was an issue that was discussed at length by council, ultimately after a lot of input from Historic Preservation Committee and Planning Commission in the 90s, as we were adopting a rule to protect what we thought was historic in this community. And prior to the adoption of the pre-1941 as historic rule, we were protecting historic districts and structures by ordinance, and we couldn't keep pace with what was changing. And so there were neighborhoods like the Johnson neighborhood. Some think it's evolved well, others don't. And we just could not, on a staff level, keep pace with all the changes that were going on. So we decided to go with a date and make everything prior to that historic. And the discussion became, well, should it be 50 years, which is what the state uses, or is there a date in Los Gatos that seems to be what the community feels is appropriate for protection? And prior to the war, architectural style was, and the types of homes that were being constructed were very unique, very different. And after the war, of course, it was a production issue, and of course the baby boom and all of that. So what the community ultimately, through the council's decision, was to make the landmark date prior to 1941. And the issue that has been discussed since that time is, should ranch-style homes, for example, be considered historic? The older we get, the less we're inclined to be receptive of some of these dates. So staff has not been receptive, council has not been receptive to using the state's kind of arbitrary 50-year rule, at least in this community, because we have not seen a type of architectural style beyond 1941 that has been really worth protecting. And if there was, we could kind of identify it. Some people are now saying the Eichlers, kind of a classic architectural style, should those be protected? If we were in Palo Alto, I think we'd be having that kind of a conversation. But we don't have those kinds of styles significantly in this community that has caused a concern about protection. That's not to say that different architectural styles aren't protected. Through these design guidelines, the whole concept of compatibility protects a variety of architectural styles. And ranch-style homes, for example, in the Belgados neighborhood, those neighborhoods are protected by these design guidelines. So, long answer to your question, but we do not see at this point a need for something other than the pre-1941.
Thank you for that long but thoroughgoing answer, and I am, this council member is in agreement with the position previously taken, but I do think that given the comments made by Ms. Woodward out of Sacramento, we may want to indicate that explicitly for the office so that they understand our rationale, because they may be assuming things about our historic orientation that don't apply.
Further questions? Mr. Glickman.
Thank you very much. First, a follow-up. I also agree with Councilmember Brzezinski that I have, and with Director Lortz, that I have a problem thinking of something that's younger than I am as being historic. Looking at this is page 11 of the staff report. Exterior lighting. There's a suggestion of adding language, lighting shall be the minimum needed for pedestrian safety. I've got a problem with that because that's very, very restrictive. It would seem to me that if somebody had a home, I agree with not having the light bulb visible, of having the lights downcast, that the issue is impact on the neighbors. But to say that you can't have enough light in your backyard to have a cookout because it has to be anything brighter than what somebody can stumble around in the dark and not hurt themselves is just too restrictive for my thought.
Did you want to respond to that, Mr. Lortz?
Well, just very quickly, a couple things on lighting, which we're all, I think, extremely sensitive about. Energy consumption is one, but safety is another. I'll give you an example. If a neighborhood like the Belgados neighborhood has a lot of those carriage lights out front with where the bulb actually is visible, and somebody wanted to put one in, note the language says should. So then I would say, well, you justify why you would want to put that in. Well, there's every home along the street has one, and it's part of the character of the neighborhood. I would say, okay, it's a should, it's not mandatory, so there's pretty good justification there. So that would be part of the application package. We'd get input from the neighbors, of course, through the regular architecture and site approval process, get feedback. So in that instance, a bulb might be allowed. And the same would hold true with safety lighting. If it was on a motion detector, for example, that would be a way to address that issue. What we want to make sure is that, the floodlights turn off when people aren't using them so they don't glare in the neighbors' backyards, and the next day I get a call.
Madam Mayor, if I may follow up, what I'm struggling with is the language which says lighting shall, not should, shall be the minimum needed for pedestrian safety. That's very clear.
Right.
That says that if I want to enjoy the use of my backyard and I want to use for that at that time a little more lighting than the minimum necessary pedestrian safety, I can't do it. I got a problem with that.
Again, I would go back to what I said about the motion detectors on the floodlight type of thing. So when it's being used, what we're talking about is, walkways where people have those downlights around their home and they're on, all night long. That's the kind of lighting that, and maybe we need to just be clearer for that.
That would be my point. Thank you.
Other questions? All right. My questions, Mr. Lortz. This is just a follow-up on your discussion with regard to fencing. This is page 4. At this juncture, I'm not going to, I'm thinking that I won't be suggesting any motion on it because what I understand you to say is that the town is going to be looking into the fencing issue at what juncture?
Part of the general plan update process, we're going to be suggesting as an implementing measure to address wildlife corridor protection, a fence ordinance.
All right. And the reason I just wanted to focus on this for a second is that the Planning Commission was attempting, as I read this, to protect wildlife corridors and the natural character of the hillsides. And I understand that there are areas that fit that description that are not protected by our hillside standards and guidelines and that exist within our residential areas. So fencing of this ilk could be appropriate. And so I was actually going to suggest we support the Planning Commission, but if we're going to be dealing with this in, relatively short order, am I looking at, 2 years?
Yes.
Okay. I may put that aside for the time being. I did have a couple of other points. First of all, on page 9, your paragraph 3, You made note in your staff report how the General Plan Committee and the Planning Commission spent a lot of time dealing with the issue of sellers, and staff recommended that we maintain the previous seller language. Akin to that, I think the General Plan Committee spent a huge amount of time talking about neighborhood compatibility, probably more than anything else, and then came up with its definition of immediate neighborhood. And if you look at your paragraph 3, currently it reads, residential development shall be similar in mass, bulk, and scale to the immediate neighborhood, and the proposed addition states, consideration will be given to existing FAR's residential square footage and lot sizes in the neighborhood. My guess would be that staff is recommending that for more flexibility, but my impression would be then we have so much flexibility that we're back to where we are now, having all the debates we do about where is the neighborhood, which is exactly what the General Plan Committee was trying to eliminate and address.
May I? Thank you. The Planning Commission on numerous occasions have looked at the size of a lot and allowed those unusual lots that have more square footage to have larger homes on them. So what we wanted to be clear about is that we have in the past given consideration to not only the floor area ratio but the residential square footages and the lot sizes in the neighborhood as we evolve the final conclusion on a particular structure. Of course, height is very, very important. Scale of that home is very, very important. But what the Planning Commission has concluded in a number of cases is if your lot is unusually large, you should be allowed to have a larger home on it, and you may be then compatible in terms of the floor area ratio, but you're not compatible in terms of the size of the home itself. So that's what we really wanted to get to there.
I hear your words, but I don't understand, because again, we get back to, we're trying to give guidance to the deciding body as to what is the neighborhood that is being examined. And again, the General Plan Committee and the Planning Commission used immediate neighborhood, and it used immediate neighborhood being the homes on the side and across. And I understand that those homes beside and across may not be cookie cutter, as Ms. McNutt indicated. But if you're looking at the homes beside and across, and those homes may be different size lots, wouldn't that already, and different FARs, wouldn't that already address the issue you're raising?
Not necessarily. The council, both the Planning Commission and the council have looked at a neighborhood in a little bit broader context than the 225 approach, and concluded that it may be possible to have a home on the 225 wouldn't lend itself to a result that allows for a bit larger home than what's in the 225. But down the street, there are a number of the larger homes, so it's part of that evolution of a neighborhood. So the Planning Commission and the council have concluded that it may be appropriate to go a little bit beyond that 225 or that narrow circle. And so we look at it as kind of an expanding ring of a review.
Again, I understand your words, but it just seems that this document will not be giving us the guidance. I understand that the council has, used homes in various locations. I don't know if the Planning Commission has done that. I do know that the General Plan Committee and the Planning Commission has passed this document forward to us after 3 long years of study. And it's just not, it just seems to me that those words that you have suggested be inserted takes away all the certainty that the General Plan Committee and the Planning Commission have tried to give us. And Mr. Przinski.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I'm going to present a little different recollection of what the General Plan Committee actually determined. As a participant with the mayor on the committee, I think it was indeed the intention of the majority that in defining neighborhood, although we used the immediate residences around the target property as the initial step towards compatibility issues, that we defined the neighborhood more broadly than that, and that a neighborhood actually comprised then an expanded view into the rest of the area that we could identify as a neighborhood, and thus the specification of certain neighborhoods, such as the Vista del Monte neighborhood or the Belgados neighborhood, as having its own character beyond just the homes that are immediately surrounding the target property. And indeed, I do recall and I do believe that the General Plan Committee, the intention was not to so clearly restrict the definition of those properties that needed to be reflected for compatibility on those immediate homes, because when we looked at a neighborhood, we realized that it goes beyond just that footprint. And I think that, therefore, yeah, indeed, we're not going to have an absolute definition and restriction to those singular properties when we present this issue to an applicant, because we feel that the neighborhoods actually have a broader definition than just those immediate properties. And so it doesn't give us any absolute mathematical calculation with which to operate, but it does give us a view to starting the dialogue with an individual who wants to enhance his or her property or remodel within the context of a broader neighborhood. I know that it doesn't leave us as explicit as some would like, but there's no question in my mind that it wasn't intended by the General Plan Committee to be as absolute as might be thought.
All right, further questions? Let me bring up one more issue, Mr. Lords, or maybe it's Mr. Korb, or maybe it's Mr. Larson. And I'm going to say right up front that this was something that I should have picked up in the year or two that this was before us on the General Plan Committee, but I did not. Right now, we're going to be asked this evening to revise our ordinances that deal with our historic neighborhoods, and the those ordinances protect protects us from demolitions in these historic neighborhoods, and then it goes on to give guidance on remodels and constructions in the historic neighborhoods. The historic neighborhoods are very important to me and to our town, and so the protections which were formerly in the ordinance for example, demolitions, are now being moved to guidelines. And so my question is, and I'm concerned that guidelines that protect us from demolitions are not as strong as ordinances. I'm led to believe that the guidelines are as strong, and so I would ask staff to explain to me publicly why the guidelines will give us the protections that the ordinance does.
Well, I'll take the first shot, and the town attorney will offer the legal background on resolution versus ordinance and standards. Couple of reasons three reasons why these changes are suggested from ordinance to resolution. The first was that the recommendation to make that change actually comes from the Historic Preservation Committee which deals and works with the rules every month. And so they've had experiences where the ordinances are inflexible to deal with a number of things, not only architecture, but also changing of building technology. So one of the things that they indicated was a concern was that right now we have ordinances, we have standards, and they're spread all over. This is one way to get them consolidated into one document where a person can go to one place and find everything they need to know about a modification or a new single-family home. Second was that to take the historic district standards and guidelines and list of contributing structures from the ordinance to a resolution. And the reason being is it gives us a little bit more flexibility to address changes in the building technology, development standards, and occasional amendments to contributing structures. And the resolution process we have found to be far more flexible and easy to update and maintain and keep updated. The types of changes in building technology that I reference is, for example, wood windows. Clad wood windows are improving every year, and the Historic Preservation Committee has found that these windows should be permitted on a case-by-case basis for select types of homes.
Mr. Rhodes, I'm going to pop in here.
And the ordinance does not provide that flexibility.
I can understand that the Historic Preservation Committee wanted one document that encompasses everything, but let's use demolition as an example. The ordinance prohibits demolition of buildings, homes in historic areas. The guidelines have the same prohibition, only it's a guideline as opposed to an ordinance. And I would seriously doubt that the Historic Preservation Committee considered the merits of a guideline versus an ordinance. And I might be wrong, but I don't think so. And so that's my concern. I don't want historic homes to be demolished, and I'm worried about reducing the protection of these homes. And so that's where I'm looking for guidance from staff. Mr. Quinn.
I think that question does come to me. When I first heard your question, it sounded like you were talking more about the process and how these changes would be processed and how the historic districts, for example, would be protected under these suggested standards and guidelines. But your question goes more to the legal distinction, if any, between ordinances and resolutions. And there is a legal distinction. Ordinances are approved in a statutorily dictated manner. It's very detailed, requires public hearings, requires ultimately 2 readings, and are equally difficult to change or amend. And they're considered law, literally law adopted by the town council. Resolutions are, in effect, statements of policy. These guidelines would be approved by resolution. They're statements of policy. But policy can be stated in a manner that is regulatory and specific or less specific. The one difference between a very specific policy adopted by resolution is that resolution could be changed more easily than an ordinance, but it can only be changed by council. If, for example, you adopt a policy by resolution and it's very strict, staff is bound to that policy. All of the subsidiary boards and commissions that review applications that are subject to that policy are bound by that policy. It's only council that has the ability to modify or eliminate that policy, and you can do so more easily than you could change an ordinance. So the simple answer to your question is ordinances are harder to change than resolutions, than policies adopted by resolutions. But policies adopted by resolution are binding on everybody, including council, unless council takes action to change it. And you can do so more easily than an ordinance. But the additional point that I think needs to be made is that it oftentimes has less to do with the manner of approval than with the specific language that is used. An ordinance can have very vague language that requires a lot of interpretation and can leave a lot of loopholes in the application of the ordinance, whereas a guideline adopted by resolution can be very specific and very restrictive and leaves no room for question. So to me, ultimately, they're both laws. They both have to be followed. It ultimately comes down to the manner in which they're drafted and how loose they are or how specific they are.
Thank you both. Other questions of staff? Okay, this is a public hearing. I have one card, and so Peggy Dallas.
Hi, I'm Peggy Dallas, and I am an architect, and I am on the Architectural Standards Committee. I really like the education that this new residential design guidelines document gives to the general public. It sets clearly the values that we're looking for as far as good design, and I think it's a very valuable document in that regard. I have a couple concerns. The introduction talks about the keeping the diverse, the variety in the neighborhoods, and that's done with respect and sensitivity to the surrounding houses. But then the rest of the document goes into talking about specifically matching any new additions or new construction to match the existing neighborhood, immediate neighborhood in particular. And if you really think about it and its long-term effects, what you're doing in this case is sort of reverse engineering tract architecture, where all the roof lines are the same and all the, front walks are the same. I think you're not getting the effect you want with this document, and you might want to reconsider that aspect. Instead of saying similar, you could say with the sensitivity and respect to the compatibility in the neighborhood. It has notably different implications. That also allows for more variety over time and vibrancy. I'm very concerned that this town, in its embracing of the historic aspects of the town, which is really, really charming. I wouldn't want to lose an ounce of it, but it's not all that way. If you don't allow new styles to emerge that have the same sort of sensitivity and respect to the compatibility of the neighborhood as far as energy in the design elements, you're not going to get any growth and vibrancy in the architecture. It'll be frozen in time back to 1991. And for that same reason, I would recommend the 50-year standard for historic structures. We just lost a really beautiful 1960s style commercial building on Shannon. It was part of the Jewish synagogue there. That was nice, but it's gone. And we have lost that aspect of our history. My other really big concern here is that I read the document, then called some architects today that I know in town, and they seemed, despite the notification, they didn't know about it, and they seemed very concerned. And I think a peer review is necessary here.
Thank you. Do we have questions for the speaker before you leave? Do you have questions? There are none. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, Mr. Glickman.
Ms. Alice, you mentioned some architects. If you would be comfortable, could you give us some idea of who they might be?
Let's see. Well, here it is. I talked to Gary Schlow, who had the document in his hand, an earlier version, but like me, waited to the last minute and didn't realize it was the last minute to look at it, because there's, the architects are busy. They don't do things unless they realize there's like a deadline coming up. It's actually going to be approved. So and I also talked to John Lean. He was surprised that this was in the works. And I talked to Louie Lou, And same thing, he was very surprised that this was in the works and very concerned. And both John Lena expressed concern, but Lulu suggested maybe a committee of architects could get together and review this. Because as far as I know, the only architect that's seen this document besides myself and someone Gary is Larry Cannon, and I really appreciate his peer review as an architect when I bring projects in, but he's like not getting the peer review he deserves here, and the town council doesn't have any architects on it, the planning commission doesn't have any architects on it, the general plan committee I don't believe has any architects on it, and the Architectural Standards Committee doesn't ever even ask to look at it. So I'm like, it needs some professional review, I think.
Madam Mayor, could I ask staff to comment?
Do you have anything?
Not only did I speak directly with John Lean about it, but he's on our distribution list.
Okay, well.
The consultants that you mentioned, Terry Martin, was also sent a copy.
Oh, that's right, Terry Martin also, I'm sorry.
Louis Lou was at the Historic Preservation Committee when it was discussed, so, they're busy and they've got a lot of things going on, so I understand why they may have missed it or forgotten that it's been in the process for so long that they may have commented on it and thought it was already adopted.
Well, yeah, it might be a professional courtesy to remind them that the decision's coming up.
Do we have other questions of the speaker? Hearing none, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I was going to say that was my only card, but I have one from Gary Schlo.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the council. My name is Gary Schlo at 213 Bean Avenue. I don't know how many times I've told you that. I appreciate Peggy calling me up this afternoon because I missed on the agenda what the agenda was this evening, but I came in as Bud Lortz was explaining amendments to the program, and there's so many good things in this book, and I think it was necessary to have this kind of guideline given to everyone that deals in the building and the design industry in Los Gatos. We all talk about the diversity throughout the community and how important it is, and I think that's really important. I think, though, the most important description of this document is the word guidelines, and I hope no one takes this as being a rule, including staff members. We as architects, we feel we don't necessarily know everything, but we do know a lot of character design and architecture, and sometimes we do get in a conflict with some things brought up to us by staff, but for the most part, I don't want to say we get it our way, but there are always some things that we're unhappy with. My partner in crime here is Jay Plett back there, and sometimes we do have a little session in the office, and we think, some of these things are just not right. But again, for the most part, this document is a good document. I tabbed a few things here. The guideline overview, I think, I don't know if it's on page 47 of my booklet here, I think is very well summarized, and I had a couple other things. Well, this section, how to read your neighborhood, like Peggy Dallas was mentioning, I'm a little fearful of what this is all about. I hope we're not graded on these things. Us architects are not graded on all of these roof overhangs, and we have to put a closed soffit on a house that we're designing in a neighborhood where 90% are closed soffits. And I don't think that's the case, but this is a little scary, and that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Good timing. Questions for Mr. Schlo? No? Oh, Mr. Gutman.
Thank
Thank you. It's just that I consider your input valuable, and just wanted to be sure that if there are other specific comments in the document, that you were able to get them into the record. Was there anything else you wanted to specifically add?
No, I apologize that I don't know as much about this. I did not really take the time to look through so much of this. There may be a few things. One of my pet peeves in town is the physical size of light wells, but I don't think we're going to get into that. I just think the narrowness and the restrictive size of light wells, they should be more gracious, but that's, and I'm not sure it's even in here, but
it's a separate policy.
Okay.
Other questions for Mr. Schlow? Yes, Mr. Wasserman.
Good evening, Mr. Schlow.
Yes, sir.
Business Person of the Year.
Thank you.
You heard Mr. Lortz mention earlier about the history, the 3 years, the General Plan, Historical Committee, Planning Commission, the various organizations, agencies, people contacted, input, et cetera, that have taken place. The modification, the fundamental idea that's taking place, the combination of these items regarding residential design guidelines and historical, combining them all into what is now an 80-page book as compared to, I don't know if you were here earlier or not, 20 years ago it was 7 pages, you know. That whole evolution that's taken place with this living document and the organizations that were involved putting it together, and when you mentioned you and your partner are never totally satisfied, believe me, we're never totally satisfied. I don't know anybody that is. But what my question to you is at the end of the day, the 3 years, the organizations, whatever, the 50 people that have participated, the dozen or so that haven't participated, whatever it is, have we moved in the right direction for architects and the community? Has what's been compiled, because I know how experienced you are with downtown historical construction, is this document better than what we had before? Have we moved in the right direction?
Definitely so. I see, I don't see it so much anymore, but 10, 15 years ago, I saw a lot of new, not only new construction, but restoration design that really missed the mark. And it missed the mark. Let's take just for instance, the physical size of a dormer or a window in a dormer, the proportions of different things that make up the beauty of a house. I see it better controlled now, and whether that's controlled by a rule or by a guideline, this is something that's going to help to progress I think the profession of historical design through Los Gatos, and that's not all I care about. Jay in my office was telling me something that I'll share with you. He mentioned Saratoga houses. He said, just make sure they don't put anything about Saratoga houses into this. and we feel that this document is a great step forward in helping Los Gatos.
Thank you. And if I may make one final comment, Madam Mayor?
Is it a question?
It's a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. And although, you know, this may not be a bullseye in your trained eye or another person's or et cetera, the fact that what we have here it sounds like, is better than what we had, and you feel is a benefit to not only architects on guidance on how to design a home to get through, et cetera, but also to residents. It benefits both the public and the professional. Again, I'm agreeing it's not perfect, but your conclusion as an expert is that this is a step in the right direction.
It's a step in the right direction. It's a step also for developers. There are design build people that don't have our training, but I don't look at the person that has designed the house without looking at the design of the house itself to to approve it or disapprove it. It's I think we all need these kind of guidelines, the homeowner, the designer, the architect, maybe even the engineer, but more so the architect.
Good foundation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Glickman.
Thank you very much. And this is a question, but I'll preface it with an introduction to the question. I humbly think that this may be one of the most important documents that this council adopts. The vast bulk of what we do is land use, and we did, I think, a good job with the hillside standards and guidelines in saying, in clarifying for the developer, for the builder, for the architect, for the homeowner, for the neighbors, what the standards of the town were, and reserved for the council the ability to accommodate exceptional circumstances. I'm a little troubled in what I heard that some of the very, very highly respected architects in town have not weighed in to the extent that I would have liked them to have, given the fact you've got to live with this, and you and some of your colleagues are responsible for some of a significant amount of the land use development that goes on in our town. So I said there would be a question, so here it comes. If this council were to defer the decision and ask for architects of your experience and stature to take some time, get together, look it over, and get back to us, what Mr. Wasserman said is very true. It's better than we had before, but I'm concerned about moving forward before it's as good, not perfect, but as good as it can be given the proper approach. If you were asked to put in that time and effort, would you do it?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, now I have no other cards. Is there anybody else who wants to speak to us on this public hearing matter? No one's rushing forward, so I'm going to close the public testimony. And we'll now look to the council. And before we do that, let me ask you to go back to the first page of our staff report, and you'll see that we have 3 different sets of decisions to make, and staff has suggested that we do them in this order. If we look at residential design guidelines, right now the Exhibit 1 we have before us is the one without any Planning Commission modifications. What our report has are proposed Planning Commission modifications, most but not all of which have been suggested that we, staff has suggested we adopt. Then we get into 2 sets of staff, new staff suggestions. Since, as I said before, I do not think we can do this as an omnibus motion, I'm going to suggest that we do it, if anybody wants to modify anything that staff is suggesting, we can do that by motion. But before I pass that on to the rest of the council, Mr. Larson, your thoughts?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I think that process will work, working through the staff report. Any changes any individual council member wants to propose from what staff has put in the staff report, or even to other parts of the residential design guidelines, the full document, beyond what staff has commented on, we could manage that here as a recordation process.
All right, then I'm going to turn to the council and begin asking you for probably your suggestions, but also for your motions. Ms. McNutt.
My suggestion is going to be a slightly different methodology on this. I very much, even before we had the architects come and speak tonight, I'm very much concerned about, even though it's been 3 years in the process, we've only been talking about it for an hour. And you know how things don't get paid attention to until it comes up to council level. And with the number of changes that are being recommended, both by Planning Commission, by staff, and during council discussion that we've already had, my suggestion would be that we take each of those in segments. If we want motions on those, that those be incorporated into a revised draft that is recirculated to the community, and a chance for us to see the edited draft as a whole and then have it returned to us. Because I know even when we're doing much smaller resolutions and there are word changes, it gets very confused and convoluted about what is it are we really doing. And this is an important document, and I really don't see the reason to rush it through in the next 15 minutes.
I have one question that I will pose, and that would it be the thought of the council that if Ms. McNutt's suggestion were to go forward, that this be returned to the General Plan Committee to begin with, or to some other body to begin with?
Was that a question for me? Oh, no.
Well, I didn't want to start getting into chatting, but yes.
Okay. No, I think it would be returned to us, but just the recirculation and public reporting that's going to happen on that would allow anyone, individual on general plan, on planning commission, architectural community, or whoever, to bring us any additional concerns that they have.
Mr. Wasserman.
Thank you. I agree with what Councilwoman McNutt has suggested, and my question to her through the mayor when she said recirculate it through the community was how community was defined.
Ms. McNutt, do you want to address that issue?
Recirculated, meaning that it's announced that a new version of the draft is available on the website and in coverage of this meeting, and we have folks from the architectural community who can gossip among themselves and get the word out that way.
Madam Mayor, can we have this conversation, or do you want me to go through you, or how do you want this done?
Well, I don't want conversation, so why don't you just say what it is that you want to communicate? I'm sure Ms. McNutt will be recognized next.
Okay. Open it up to the community is the way Ms. McNutt said. I understand that, and what I guess I need to hear is the second step of that process. So it's put out there. Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones says, this is my suggestion. Where is that suggestion coming to? Is that going to Mr. Lortz? Is it coming to, where is it going? How is it processed? How is it evaluated? And how is it ultimately brought forward to us as a suggestion? My concern is community development gets 1,100 phone calls and emails, and how it's all filtered and done. What do we do with that new information that we're soliciting?
Well, I'm going to say that I'm sure it's going to come to the council by Ms. McNutt. Anything else you want to add?
No, but I doubt if community development's got 1,100 inquiries about this over 3 years. But it would be just like anything else that comes to council. So they can email, they can write a note that becomes part of public record, or they can come and testify.
Okay, I'll put it more this way, if I may, Madam Mayor. What I'm saying is, in this case, if Mr. Schlow evaluates this, comes up with something, a suggestion he has on page 17, it should be blah, 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 blah. We need to put that instruction out to the community if we're sharing this with the community and soliciting input. Then I need to understand how that input will be processed. So it goes out there, Mr. Schlow has these recommendations. He then is to, I don't need him to contact me and say, hey, Mike, you ought to make them green instead of blue. I want him to speak with Mr. Lortz to get this into a way that makes sense and in the appropriate area.
All right. The way that would be handled would be determined by whatever motion we pass. However, that being said, I will look to staff for some guidance. Mr. Larson.
Yes, Madam Mayor and members of the council, as we start the general plan process and a number of significant development items and inevitable staffing issues in the town, we're not worried about workload impacts. So we'd recommend a simplified, streamlined process as much as possible. 2 scenarios I'd lay out for your consideration. One would be mimicking what we did with the massage ordinance. We bring back to you a consolidated residential design guidelines with any direction you provide tonight based on the changes encompassed in the staff report, plus any else you come up with during your discussion. Then we republish that as a final document to bring to you. That's implemented for a year, and we then do an evaluation and bring back changes as part of a continuous improvement project. That's one scenario that mimics best the massage ordinance. A second scenario, if we want to reach out to the community in particular, I'm trying to think what would be easiest to handle at the staff level, and what I worry about is if we publish one document with your direction tonight, then send it back to the community, we'll then have another discussion with you with another round of changes that would probably lead to another republishing before it's brought back to you, and I'd like to condense that into one cycle, both for workload and timeliness purposes. My recommendation would be then, if the council wants to pursue a broader community discussion rather than a test, we get your direction tonight on changes. We do a one-shot meeting, probably disproportionately focused to the architect community and maybe others who have touched the document and commented on it, saying, here's where we're going, and we provide that feedback to you in a single pass with the revised document. So it's a single revised document that's produced.
And are you suggesting, Mr. Larson, and I may have lost you somewhere in there, that the single revised document is akin to the massage ordinance? Or
No, the first scenario is basically we take your direction tonight, we bring that back with the implementing ordinances as soon as possible, and we live with that for a year as a significant of improvement over what is, and then we will evaluate it with the community 9 months to a year after we've worked with it and seen how it works. That's proposal one, that I think would be staff's recommendation just from a workload management perception. Recommendation two, given what I've heard at least two council members discuss, is the notion of get your direction tonight on the document. Before we republish, go back out to the community, focusing probably on the architects, get additional input on where we are, what are other changes, and then publish a single document that comes back to you for action. And I would recommend implementing ordinances to follow after that, because you may then have further changes when it comes back to you.
Ms. McNutt.
May I ask Mr. Larson a question?
Certainly.
Mr. Larson, on your scenario one, the massage ordinance, I'm assuming that the revised document that would come back to us as an agendized item, we would have public testimony on that, and that at that time, if there was anyone in the community of any ilk that had something major to say, that the council at that time could still make a modification, but that we wouldn't be looking for the details like the word dormer shows up too many times or whatever, those kinds of refinements that we might, if we do. I mean, because I am not looking for our architects or anyone in the community to sit there and go through and give us 17 pages of notes. I'm looking for the broad issues that we're off on a little bit. So is that true that there would still be an opportunity for?
Absolutely. I'm confident the public will come and speak if they identify issues, and that the council will follow the wisdom of those comments.
And then the idea is then you put it into place for a year, and then at the end of that year, then you can do both the major and the minor refinements that are needed.
Mr. Lichtman.
I think I hear a process being fine-tuned, and I, first of all, very, very much appreciate the manager's comments and his reminder about workload on the staff. I'm not uncomfortable with where I think we're going with a caveat. I do think that the segments of the community that I really want to hear from is the architectural community, because these are the folks who have to live with this, they have to implement it, they have to explain to their clients what they can and can't do. So I would hope that, I'm okay with the process you outlined, but I would hope that in the intervening period before it comes back to us, staff could take the responsibility for convening a meeting with those architects who would wish to participate. Mr. Schlow indicated that he would be willing to give the time. Perhaps 2 meetings tops, because being sensitive to people's schedules. And I'm not averse to getting some detailed input, which then the staff can summarize for us. And then that's it. Then it comes back to us. We add our comments tonight so that people will understand what things the council is and isn't comfortable with and the directions that they want to go. Submit that to an appropriate gathering. Certainly make it available to the entire community for anybody who has the right and wish to participate. Then you come back to us, then we finalize it, and then I don't have a problem with taking it out for a spin for a year. Does that work for you?
That sounds like option 2.
Yes.
But we're certainly subject to council direction.
Yes, and if I might say, that isn't what I heard staff recommending, and quite frankly, if I were going to send this out for more meetings, I would send it back to the General Plan Committee and the Planning Commission. But that isn't where I have here staff suggestions, and I'm not sure if that's where this council is going. I hear people saying just coming back to us and then a one-year trial run. So maybe what I'm going to suggest we do at this time is have Mr. Larson or Mr. Lortz verbalize their suggested process, and I will ask, and I'll find out if a majority of the council concurs.
Here's the suggested process. I'll try to blend the comments I've heard. Staff will reissue the residential design guidelines with any direction we're given from council tonight, and we would like that direction, so I hope we get to going through the report. That will answer a lot of questions. So whatever direction we're given tonight, we'll reissue that, republish it. We will do a targeted distribution of that to the architectural community in town, and we'll certainly contact the 2 to 3 architects who are here tonight as part of that distribution, and we will let them know that we would encourage them to comment to staff in advance of the council meeting when those guidelines come back to council, but they certainly have the opportunity to come to the council meeting and to speak directly to the council on those issues. We will not bring forward at that time the implementing ordinances, because there very well may be council changes to the guidelines that are adopted that night based on comments from the architect community or other members of the public, or from the council's reread of a consolidated finished document, and we would then bring back the implementing ordinances later.
I would be very supportive of that.
Okay, Ms. McNutt, would you be supportive of that process?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Wasserman?
Yes, ma'am.
And Mr. Przinski?
Yes.
All right. And Mr. Lortz, Mr. Larson, given what you said about the implementing ordinances, I understand that a number of the motions that staff has suggested encompass the implementing ordinances to which you're making reference. So what I see our job tonight is simply to make motions which would modify our document Exhibit 1 and leave our motions at that. Is that correct?
Correct. It's really recommendation 1 of the staff report, which works through the staff report, all the changes therein, and the document itself.
All right, now I will ask the council to, and there might be items above and beyond what I'm going to say, but on the staff report beginning on page 4, where it says Planning Commission, we then go through 13 items that are suggested changes by the Planning Commission, all but 2 of which staff agrees with. And so I'm going to look to the council and ask how you want to proceed with those 13 suggestions, either in total or one at a time. Ms. McNutt.
What I would suggest is, based on preliminary comments that we heard, do you want this in the form of motions?
Yes, let's try it in the form of motion.
All right, so I will move to adopt or have staff include the comments from Planning Commission numbers 1 through 13 minus number 7, which is Seller, which I think some folks want to talk about in more depth, and I'll stop there and see where we go.
Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
All right, so we have a motion that we include in the revised guidelines 1 through 13 of our staff report C, with the exclusion of 7. We have a second, and I will simply...
And I'm sorry, I need to clarify one thing. My 1 through 7 is the staff's recommendations. So on number 1, there was what Planning Commission had, and then there was staff's revised on that. So I'm talking about staff's recommendations, number 1 through 13, minus Sellers.
And what is your suggestion on Seller?
I don't want to talk about Sellers right now. I want to get these out of the way and then do Sellers separately.
All right, so we're going to do 1 through 13. We're going to follow staff's recommendations, and one of those is a negative, and then we are not going to do Sellers, which is number 7 at this time. We have a second. Mr. Wasserman.
You just answered my question. No question.
Further discussion. Mr. Glickman.
Thank you very much. And I did second the motion because I agree with the bulk of it. I did, as I mentioned earlier, have some specific suggestions for changes to some of the numbered items, and let me go through them and then see if we get any council concurrence.
All right, Mr. Glickman, if this is going to be in the form of a motion to amend her motion?
Yes, it is.
All right, then, Ms. McNutt, I would ask you as he goes through each one to just see if you simply adopt or accept what he says.
All right. Beginning on page 5, number 5, neighborhood patterns and types, the suggestion was to remove the word desirable after some changes in everyone desirable, and replace that with language saying may be an improvement to the existing structure and or neighborhood. My suggestion was to replace the word desirable with welcome, followed by the word and then put in the italicized text.
Ms. McNutt, do you accept that?
I'm thinking. Just a moment. For me, I think I'm happy with the staff's version of that.
All right, I'll go along with that as well. On number 6, rather, where each paragraph ends with the word possible, I would suggest replacing it with appropriate.
And I totally agree with that.
Okay.
All right, so we have a motion to amend paragraph 6 so that all of the possibles become appropriates. We have a motion and a second. Discussion. Hearing none. All in favor? Aye. Okay, so that's unanimously approved modification of that motion. Mr. Glickman, anything else?
Just wanted to, because again, we're not talking about sellers now. On the websites, just change the language to say current websites because they change so often. And the staff will provide a list.
And that's fine.
All right, and we're looking at number 6?
We are looking at number 6, kind of the last bullet. We provide a list of a current list of various sources of information and their websites. And then first bullet, they're mentioning a specific one. I probably want to take that out because it may not last very long. Websites don't.
All right, Mr. Glickman, I'm looking at the paragraph that begins on page 88, Appendix D. I need to better understand how you want to change that.
Sure.
Is that where you're looking?
I am now.
Talking about the bullet above it.
Oh, provide a list of various sources for green building information and their websites, and you want to change it by?
Will be periodically updated.
Okay. And that's all right with you, Ms. McNutt?
Well, we just moved from current to will be periodically updated, but...
I think it's the same thing. Whatever you like.
Current, please.
Current is fine.
Current.
Okay.
So now we're going to provide a current list?
Right.
And that's all right with Ms. McNutt. Is it all right with everybody here on the council?
Okay.
All right, we have, what's your name, Mr. Glickman? That's by consensus. We have that modification. Mr. Glickman?
That's it?
All right, further discussion of Ms. McNutt's motion. Seeing none, and I will just say I am going to support the motion. I do believe that the suggestions made by the Planning Commission on fences have a lot of merit, but I do further understand that the fence issue is going to be considered as we proceed through the general plan. That being said, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That portion passes unanimously. Anything else? Now, does anybody want to go back to the cellars? Nope. All right. Mr. Wasserman.
Maybe I missed something. The motion we just approved was approval of items 1 through 13 with staff's 2 recommendations and Mr. Glickman's 2 amendments. And now we're addressing cellar?
Ms. McNutt excluded cellars from her motion.
Okay, so now we're having a discussion on cellar?
We could if somebody wants to, yes.
Okay, thank you.
But I don't see anybody jumping up and down to discuss cellars.
Madam Mayor?
Mr. Glickman, or, sorry, Mr. Brzezinski.
We look alike.
We're often confused. Why don't we discuss cellar?
Mr. Brzezinski, do you have something you would like to discuss? I will jump right in here. I'll discuss cellar. Cellar was a big point of discussion in the General Plan Committee. I was actually comfortable with the wording that finally came out of the General Plan Committee, and so I concur with staff's recommendation, as I understand it, that we stay with the General Plan Committee wording. So that's where I am on this issue. Anybody else want to discuss it? Mr. Brzezinski.
Madam Mayor, I am in agreement with you on this one. I think that having worked that particular language, it definitely clarified where we are with the seller's whole concept, and I would move to accept the staff document and exclude the amendments by the Planning Commission in this particular case.
I would second that.
Motion by Mr. Brzezinski, seconded by Mr. Wasserman, to follow staff's recommendation and keep the General Plan Committee wording. I agree with that motion. And further discussion?
Just a clarification. So we are saying that we are not going to include the italicized language?
Correct.
Thank you. That I concur with.
Further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. We are now to staff comments. Now, staff comments divide into 2 sections. On page 9, we have staff comments 1 through 3, and I would suggest that we begin with those 3.
Mayor, would you like a motion?
Certainly, Ms. McNutt.
Fine, then I will move that we ask staff to incorporate into the draft their suggested recommendations, numbers 1 through 3 on page 9.
Second.
We have a motion by Ms. McNutt, seconded by Mr. Brzezinski, to ask staff to include in the new document or revised document the suggestions on 1 through 3 of page 9. Discussion? Seeing none, I am going to support the motion. I still have concerns about some of the suggestions, the additions, but I'm going to see this document again, so we'll see what happens. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. See, I have a lot more confidence now that it's coming back. Say whatever you want. All right, now we have pages 9 through 11. Here we have 8 items. Do we have a motion? Ms. McNutt.
I think I will move for incorporating numbers 1 through 6 and 8. I'm excluding exterior lighting from this discussion, with 2 additional modifications that I talked about earlier, so that on number 2, on the example after the EG, terrain of the lot and lots with multiple frontages, we also add something like diversity in parcel size, and that on number 4, on the setbacks, that a phrase be added such as that gives more explanation for the reader. And I'll let staff figure out what that should be.
I have a suggestion.
Okay, and this
I'll
is...
second that motion.
All right, well, let's wait till we get the full motion, and we have what on number 4, Mr. Lortz?
Councilmember McNutt had asked for a such as provision, and the such as would be inserted into it, the words such as lot constraints including, such as lot constraints including topography, trees, creeks, lot size, and architectural style.
That sounds good to me.
All right, we have a motion by Ms. McNutt, seconded by Mr. Wasserman, correct?
Yes.
Discussion. All right, and this is 1 through 6, 8, it excludes 7, and it modifies 2 and 4. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. Now we get to exterior lighting. What does anybody want to do with that one?
I'll take a swing at that.
Mr. Glickman.
I'll move that we accept the language without the italicized lighting shall be the minimum needed for pedestrian safety. I would look to staff, based on our earlier discussion, my earlier discussion, if you wanted to suggest some alternative language which encompass the concern, and I think you had also said something about not wanting a complete prohibition on visible bulbs. So given our earlier discussion, would you suggest some language, Mr. Lortz? Through the mayor, of course.
Mr. Lortz?
Give me just a second here. Not as fast as I used to be since I was left-handed.
And I should note that I'm thinking about a home on University Avenue. It's probably one of the homes that's in our design guidelines, and it has lighting in front that wouldn't comply with pathway, and it doesn't interfere, and it's pretty nice.
And I'm thinking of a neighbor on my street who occasionally shows movies on the side of his house and invites the neighbors to come watch. I don't think that's the minimum needed for pedestrian safety, but they're good movies.
Except lighting on motion detectors or that is being used for outdoor activities.
Good for me.
Right, was that a motion?
It is.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Mr. Weissman, discussion? Mr. Przinski.
Madam Mayor, I actually would have been satisfied with the language just excluding lighting shall be the minimum needed for pedestrian safety, because we're trying to control impacts on neighborhoods. And I think the language, as stated initially, focuses on just that it keeps the lighting directed down, and it protects the fixture from a direct impact because the bulb is covered. And I guess my thought is there is decorative lighting that is very attractive in this community and is not intrusive into neighbors' yards or their view shed. And I'm wondering if we're attempting to over-regulate at this point, given the recommendations. I personally think the language covers what we're attempting to achieve if we exclude the lighting shall be minimum needed for pedestrian safety. I could be convinced otherwise by Mr. Lortz, perhaps, but I think to say then we're going to I guess, attempt to prohibit people from having lighting if it's not on some kind of motion detector, or if people aren't in the backyard at the time. And, first of all, it's not enforceable. And second of all, it may be a little bit too draconian.
Let's try.
Before I recognize you, I'm going to recognize me. I happen to agree with Mr. Przinski. All I would do is get rid of that last sentence because he put it very well, decorative but not intrusive. I think it's acceptable. That's what I was talking about, the house on University, the one you have somewhere in this book. So that would be my inclination. So I will therefore not be supporting the motion. Mr. Lortz.
Just a suggestion that before the sentence that says lighting shall be the minimum needed for pedestrian safety is to say circulation lighting shall be the minimum necessary for pedestrian safety. So we're just addressing that issue of pedestrian safety for circulation lighting. So as you go around a home, it's low-level lighting that's needed for pedestrian safety. It doesn't address any of the other types of things that were being discussed about motion detectors or any of those kinds of things.
All right, let me now go back to Mr. Glickman. I think this is your motion, if I remember correctly. Is circulation lighting a suggestion acceptable to you?
Unfortunately, no. I appreciate the attempt to, and I don't want to be draconian, and I appreciate the attempt to fine-tune the language, but on the one hand, I don't want to over-restrict. On the other hand, I can envision somebody's neighbor putting up one of those high-intensity lights you see on barns from airplanes, which pretty much light up a good part of the state. And if somebody's neighbor does that, that's not. That's what I was looking for. Something that's permissive with an upper limit, and minimum needed for pedestrian safety really wasn't it. So that's the improvement in the language I was looking for. But there is a level beyond which it starts to become, I can't go to sleep without blackout shades. So that's the kind of top-end restriction I was looking for, not twiddling around with what your twinkle lights look like.
All right, before I recognize Mr. Wasserman, would one of staff please remind me what the motion is that is currently before us?
There is a motion.
I had actually made a motion to, before I made the motion, to ask staff for suggested language. So I think that's where we're at. I'm waiting for the language.
All right, Mr. Wasserman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. When Mr. Glickman first raised this issue when we were talking about it the first time around, he brought up number 7 and his objection to over-regulating and removing that italicized phrase. And I thought that was a great idea. And I don't want to over-regulate that either. And Mr. Lortz, in response to what Mr. Glickman said, pointed a couple sentences up above and said all exterior lighting fixtures should, not must. So I did second Mr. Glickman's motion a few moments ago with the additional verbiage, but I would suggest to the motion maker, as the seconder of your motion, to go back to Plan A and just delete that lighting shall be the minimum needed for pedestrian safety. That's italicized.
All right, so we have a motion by Mr. Glickman, seconded by Mr. Wasserman.
Great.
To have 7 up to the word insert the following for further discussion. Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Passes unanimously. We're not done yet. As staff pointed out, there may be items that the council wants to speak to that are not part of the staff report. Do I hear any motion of that ilk? Mr. Glickman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I can do this in the form of a motion. I can do it in the form of comments. How would you like it?
Well, comments aren't going to get us anywhere, so I would suggest a motion.
All right, very well. Okay, we've already taken care of that. All right, on page 19, 2.4.2, I would suggest adding the word generally after R. Circular driveways are generally discouraged. And on the second bullet, circular driveways may be appropriate for large estate lots. I find the language here to be a little bit too discouraging. 2.4.4.
And Madam, do we have a? I was going to ask him if there's a motion, Mr. Larson.
I just wanted to make sure we were able to record the changes.
Okay.
Get them both.
So I'm suggesting in 2.4.4, bullet 1, circular driveways are generally discouraged. Second bullet, circular driveways may be appropriate for larger estates.
Is that a motion?
Yes, it is.
Is there a second? Dies for lack of second.
Okay, on page 23, 3.3.2, two-story houses may not be appropriate for every neighborhood. The problem I have with this is that it's implying that there are neighborhoods that are all one-story houses and will never change. I would suggest removing the bullet.
Is that a motion?
Yes, it is.
Second? By anybody? No second. Motion dies for lack of second.
I'm on a roll. Page 36, 3.11.4, solar panels. The first bullet is locate solar panels so they are inconspicuous from the public right-of-way. I think we've evolved a bit from the time when solar panels were sort of like pregnancy. You hit it unless it was appropriate. I think that they are now something that people can be a bit proud of. So as long as that they are architecturally compatible and well-designed, I don't think we want to hide them from the public right-of-way. So I would suggest removing the first bullet, because it may impose design constraints that are incompatible with having them face in the right direction.
There's a motion to eliminate the first bullet under 311.4. I have a question of staff. Given what we've been learning lately, that seems to have makes sense. Any input?
We had, by your prior motion, we included some language on the solar that were
Advisory guidelines. So these items are advisory guidelines. So we're clarifying that that's all we're suggesting to someone, is that they are advisory.
So they've been softened already for all three in the whole category.
So the introductory statement says, the town supports the use of alternative energy sources and provides the following advisory guidelines to reduce potential visual impacts of solar energy systems.
And then the 3 would be listed after that.
Where are you reading from?
Staff report.
I'm sorry?
The staff report.
Oh, the staff report, okay.
On
All right.
page 10.
Okay, given that introduction, Mr. Glickman, do you still want to eliminate that first bullet?
Yes, I do. That's a motion.
Right. I'm thinking. I get to think, too. Is there a second? I'm thinking about seconding it. I'm going to second it. Further discussion. Ms. McNutt.
This is a concern that I had when I went through this, and for the very reasons that Council's already articulated, that we are in support of green initiatives, and this seems contradictory. So I was pleased when I saw staff's recommendation on the introductory lead-in to these bullet points, because I think it gives the context and the flexibility that people need, so that if you read it as a whole, an advisory guideline is to locate the solar panels so that they're inconspicuous. It's not an order, it's not a restriction, it's a recommendation for, if you can, put them where they're not seen. So I'm comfortable with the way it currently stands because of the additional language that we approved 2 or 3 motions previously.
Further discussion. Mr. Brzezinski.
I think the question here is aesthetics. And we know that the industry is currently responding to what has been a significant request from the architectural community to design solar panels so that they are actually attractive. And so the age of the bulky blue panel on the roof is quickly going away. because the industry is catching up to this one issue that is significant to all of us, and that is architectural integrity and aesthetics in the community. And so I might recommend that there might be language developed at the staff level to, rather than to say, make the panels inconspicuous, to either take that language and amend it to include language that recommends that the individual who is questioning the inclusion of solar include the most aesthetically pleasing and the most appropriate architectural examples of solar when they're designing their structure. And I think that would get to what we really want, because I've seen new panels now, even over at down the block at Akina, that look like a flat panel dark skylight rather than a solar panel. And I know they're actually building now roof tiles that are solar, so that the impression eventually will be you can have an entire solar roof and not know you have a solar roof. So I would like to see us emphasize that as the point of view.
And I heartily concur.
I do too. I seconded the motion because I thought that I'd rather have no bullet at all than to have the sort of the harsh positional wording that exists now. Softened wording would be acceptable. So I'm going to go back to the maker of the motion. Mr. Glickman, you want to withdraw or change your motion?
Well, again, I'm going to give staff the opportunity to suggest language based on the council discussion, and then we'll see where the motion goes.
All right, right now we have a bullet, removing the bullet as the motion. We've had discussion. Do you have any wording that you would like to suggest?
Consider newer architecturally compatible solar systems.
Fine with me.
It's okay.
I would modify the motion to say that.
Seconder agrees. Further discussion? Mr. Wasserman.
Thank you. So what is the motion suggesting be omitted and what is being replaced?
We're going to replace the first bullet with
consider newer architecturally compatible solar systems with a right hand.
Okay. Okay.
Further discussion? Mr. Brzezinski.
I think that's good for starters.
Yeah.
I don't know if that actually captures it. I'm perfectly fine with the staff going back and spending some time on it and coming back in that final document. I think you see the direction we're heading on this thing.
Well, and I think we're going to go a lot further. When we go through the general plan update, we're going to have a whole sustainability ordinance that'll probably come out of that.
Mr. Maker of the motion, Mr. Glickman.
Let me make this comment. Okay.
I was going to ask if possibly your motion is that we have a new first bullet that has wording like, but need not be exactly like the one proposed by Mr. Wilberts.
That would be perfectly acceptable.
Okay. Further discussion? All right. Seeing none, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously. Mr. Glickman, do you have anything further?
4.8.17, exactly the same change. Right here. 4.8.17 on page 53, bullet 1.
I just found an error. I didn't see that one. You probably mean 4.8.16 because there's two 17s.
Good point. I do indeed. I would first move that we modify it to 4.8.16 and then remove the first bullet.
So
Or replace it with the language we just adopted.
all right, we have a motion to replace the first bullet with the wording we just adopted and to change 17 to 16. I'll second that. Discussion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Passes unanimously. Anything further?
One last one. This is on page 55. It's the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth bullet under 410, new construction. Let me read the language. All doubts or insufficiencies regarding an applicant's proposal regarding the consistency of a proposed new structure, style, and design with that of a contributing structure in the district will be resolved against the application by the deciding body. It's pretty harsh. Mr. Willis, what does that mean?
Is that from existing code? We did not revise existing code there, so that's existing code.
Then I suggest we remove it. I'll make that motion.
We have a motion to remove, I think that's the
Fifth bullet, under 410 on page 55.
Is there a second? Mr. Wasserman?
I'm happy to second for purposes of discussion because I have a question of staff.
All right, question of staff? Mr. Wasserman?
Thank you. As I read that one, and I understand it was pre-existing, I appear to be interpreting it as perhaps Mr. Glickman is as well. All doubts will be resolved against the application. Am I missing an interpretation of, am I misunderstanding some words there? Or is that just negatively written from many, many, many years ago?
Negatively written from many, many years ago.
Fine. Okay, and may I have a follow-up question, Madam Mayor?
Certainly.
Thank you. Given that that bullet paragraph had a purpose many, many years ago, should it be modified, rather than just deleted, should it be modified slightly, perhaps omitting against the application, and just will be resolved? Should there be a modification to that bullet, or should it just be omitted?
We could evolve that language and bring that back to you, just like the language on this solar issue.
Okay.
Madam Mayor, if I may make a comment.
Hold on, we have a motion, seconded for purpose of discussion by Mr. Wasserman. I saw Mr. Brzezinski's hand.
Just a reminder, this is the historic district that we're focusing on. This is not all construction. Right. And my assumption is that this language is forceful to maintain our historic stock. And that's probably why it exists. It's not applicable to all construction. It's not applicable to non-historic structures. So I would second what I would agree with what Mr. Wasserman's indicating, that there's an issue that probably needs to be sustained. The language is awkward in and of itself, with so many references to proposal and proposed and so forth. So it's poorly constructed at face, but I'm thinking that we probably do not want to delete this because of what it's attempting to say about preservation.
And I agree. I mean, what this is telling me, first of all, we'll go back to the fact that I have concerns about this document protecting our historic neighborhoods. In that context, what this paragraph is telling me is if you don't know, then you rule or you decide against the application that does not appear to be complying with our rules. I find that comfortable, although I agree that the wording isn't the best ever. So I will go back to Mr. Glickman. You have a motion of sorts, a motion that has sort of been seconded. Do you want that motion to stay?
Well, let me say this. The language as it exists, for example, says all doubts. That means that anybody who raises any point, however trivial, suddenly becomes a doubt. And then we decide against the applicant. I have legal problems with this language. So I concur that we do want to have language which protects our historic districts and prevents people from shooting from the architectural hip. But this isn't the language. We need to fix this. So I think my motion would be that we direct staff to come back with more appropriate language which accomplishes the council's intent and purpose without stepping on itself legally.
Mr. Wasserman?
I will second that for the body of what he was saying. I'm not jumping into whether we step on ourselves legally or not. Mr. Brzezinski's comment that this is in there to say that if there are any doubts regarding modifying a historic structure, if there's doubts, we shouldn't do it because we're trying to preserve the historic neighborhood. I agree with that. I agree with Mr. Glickman's position that this isn't quite right. So if your motion, Mr. Glickman, is to send this back to staff for a rewording that keeps the intent but changes the wording, I'm seconding that.
It is.
And I'm going to support it because of the words Mr. Wasserman's just verbalized. If there's doubts, don't do it. Oh, that sounds like a slogan. If there's doubts, don't do it. That's the concept I would like to see more artfully posed in this bullet. Further discussion?
I guess my only comment is that I just want to be a little bit careful about any doubt. I mean, there has to be something in there that indicates that the doubt raised has to have some merit.
To be clear, staff understands we will reword this to clarify the awkwardness of the language and the absoluteness of the language. Both of that will be cured in the rewrite Bud will give you.
Fine. We're going to address reasonableness and awkwardness. Further discussion? Hearing none. Good. All in favor?
Aye.
Passes unanimously. Anyone else have any other motions on this wonderful document? Then I will turn to staff. Do you have any questions of us at this juncture?
No.
Great, thank you.
I do have one question, Madam Mayor.
Figures.
And that is, if it's my understanding that council has given direction to make modifications through a process already described and to bring this back to council at a future date. This is a notice public hearing with regard to the proposed ordinances that would amend the zoning code to save the town the expense and effort associated with renoticing the hearing. My suggestion to council would be to move to continue this matter, the public hearing on this matter, to a date certain, at which time the hearing would be continued and people could speak to the ordinances and anything else that council will be considering.
Thank you for reminding me. It seems to me that there's a lot of work here, and so it also seems to me that this isn't going to come back quickly, but I will ask what you suggest.
We will certainly follow council's advice. We were willing to set an aggressive target of a continuation of the hearing to September 15th. That would require a quick turnaround. We also thought it might be possible, and this would be subject to council's advice, to conclude the public hearing, and then we would have just the typical public comment when the item came back, given we fulfilled the statutory requirements, but subject to council advice.
I wouldn't recommend doing that. I understand what the manager is suggesting. However, you have encouraged people to come in and comment further on the process and perhaps on the ordinance as well. You've indicated that the ordinances may need to be modified depending on what happens with the changes to or proposed changes to the guidelines. So I think in order to address the possibility that the ordinances may draw further comment, it's best to continue the public hearing. However, one thing I should point out, you can continue the public hearing to an aggressively set date, and if for some reason staff or council is not ready to hold the public hearing on that date, you can continue it again. So you're not necessarily bound to that date.
All right, I'm going to go back to Mr. Lortz and Mr. Larson. You've given us, I think September 15 is very aggressive, but if that's the date you want us to continue, or suggested we continue, is that it?
There are some internal reasons why we have to keep aggressive on this. Otherwise, I'll lose momentum, and I've got a capacity issue coming up.
All right. Do we have a motion? Ms. McNutt.
Move to continue this item to September 15th.
Second.
Motion by Ms. McNutt, seconded by Mr. Glickman to continue this item to September 15th. Discussion, hearing none. All in favor? Aye. Passes unanimously.
And just for the public, the council has continued the public hearing to September 15th. Anybody interested in the matter can contact the Community Development Department. There will be no further notice of the public hearing.
We have no other business, so we will now go to the three items that have been pulled from the consent calendar. The first one is Agenda Item 1, which is accept Treasurer's Report for April through June 2008, pulled by Citizen Ray. You have 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I pulled it because I think we should take a moment to understand the beautiful financial position this town is in. And this statement for 3 months ending the fiscal year says it all, okay? This month, the portfolio balance of Los Gatos, the town of Los Gatos, amounts to $76,714,000 plus, okay? 1 year ago, it was $73,499,000. What a wonderful financial position, considering what's going on in the financial world of the South Bay in municipal government, as pointed out by Mr. Larson several meetings ago. Most communities are having a terrible time financially. Los Gatos, woo, beautiful, beautiful. And let's take a look at the interest for the fiscal year. Interest received from investments. Year to date, in the fiscal year, in round figures, $3 million. $3 million. Wow. And that's a slush fund, uncommitted. So please, members of the council, don't poor mouth anybody, okay? The facts are all here. You've got money to do what you reasonably want to do. And so let's be overjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we have, first of all, is there any response by staff or any discussion by council?
I did want to clarify one comment. The town certainly does not maintain in any way, shape, or form anything approaching a slush fund, and that has an implication and is a use of language that's inappropriate in a public sector organization.
Thank you. We have a motion. Mr. Glickman.
What we're being asked to do is accept the report, and I have some concerns about the report. This is an issue we've discussed before, which is that a not insignificant part of the town's funds are held in federal mortgage-backed securities. We are told, both by our treasurer and by our consulting agency, MBIA Asset Management, that we should continue to have confidence in the investments we have in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And I recognize that we are not reinvesting as they mature. Nonetheless, I'm going to suggest that we not wait that long and remove the funds. There's a quote here in the MBIA report that says that senior debt for those two agencies has a very high rating because of the implied guarantee that the U.S. government would support these institutions. It says further down, clearly the fundamentals do not favor public housing-related financials at this time. The problem is that and we received a desk item by mail, which I don't see actually on the desk, reminding us that the U.S. Congress has just moved to strengthen confidence in these two agencies, not by guaranteeing their investments, but by increasing their ability to borrow money. And it appears that the federal government has gone to some lengths to reassure us that we shouldn't worry. When the federal government assures me that I shouldn't worry, I worry. It would be again my recommendation that we not wait until these securities mature, but even at the risk of somewhat diminished interest, reinvest before they collapse. Thank you.
All right, and I should point out that that I've also expressed a concern to staff about these two types of investments. I also received that email That was supposed to be a desk item, and quite frankly, I didn't have a chance to look at it before I came home. Came here, seems like home, before I came here. Do you have anything you want to add before I turn this over to the council for its discussion?
Our finance director, Mr. Conway, can deal with the substance of the issues. It is our pattern and practice to provide desk items at your places. I apologize if this was only provided via email. I do see some council members have the email copies, and we will make sure we provide it physically as well in the future.
All right, council, questions of staff or a motion? Mr. Wasserman.
Thank you. Question, Mr. Conway. As I'm reading the staff report, the investment assets of concern appear to represent about 9% of our portfolio?
Correct.
Okay. The assets that have been mentioned that appear to represent 9% of our portfolio, they would have a certain market value now as compared to the maturity value, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so if we were to liquidate that 9% position now in those items, we would then have to realize the reduced gain, the current market value, as compared to holding them to maturity. And that difference could be, 10, 15, 20%, whatever, from maturity value, face value?
Well, Councilmember Wasserman, the question, as I understand it, is if we liquidated them now at market value,
yes,
would we take a loss, or is there a gain? Prior to the negative press and...
Excuse me for interrupting. No, that's not the question.
Okay.
What the question is my assumption correct? If we were to liquidate them now, that would be a value of 80% of X, as compared to holding them to maturity and getting X. As far as whether it's a profit or a gain is not what I'm interested in. I'm just looking at if we consider the idea of liquidating that 9% position that it has been raised as a concern, any idea how much of a loss we would have to recognize and not be able to recoup?
The last time that I looked at it in detail, and I haven't gotten the treasurer's report where those assets are marked to market, which is done by our by asset management, so I don't have the details for June 30th. But the last time I looked at that, I think approximately 18 of the 21 individual investments had positive market value, and 3 were below, we would say underwater, that if you sold them, you would lose some principal. So at that time, when we last discussed this issue, we recommended to council, the treasurer recommended, and I also recommended that we hold them to maturity so not to lose any principal. And the point I was going to make is when the press came out early in July with some concerns about Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, those investments, had we sold them and panicked and sold them, we may have taken a loss. So I have now that the president last week, I was fairly confident that the U.S. government would not allow a financial panic to result from any concern about these agency notes, which are invested widely across the United States. And so our recommendation at the time was to buy and was to hold and not panic, and because we just didn't see that as a viable option for the U.S. government to allow these agencies so integral to our society and our economy to fail. So I guess my long answer to that is now when we look at our asset, probably July 31, we'll get a more realistic view of what our asset value is worth in terms of our individual, that 9%. It probably has rebounded where it's prior to that. I'm guessing that it would be probably 18 or 21 would be positive in market value, and there might be a couple just because of the interest rate that may be underwater. So I think at that time it was in the low millions of loss on those 3, the cumulative principal if we had to sell prematurely.
Thank you. If I may interrupt through the mayor. Thank you. If the 18 of 21 are above water, like you said.
They were at
right, and if July 31st you find the same to be true, and the net of the whole package is above water.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts, for instance, giving direction through whatever investment advisor, treasurer, whatever is appropriate, just putting a stop loss at break even? I mean, just suggesting something like that. That way the town doesn't lose any principal, and they have upside potential only. Is that something that can be recommended?
If that was council's desire, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Let me follow up on that, because I'm listening to the way, I mean, that seems like a reasonable thing, but I'm also listening to the tone of your response, which was, if council wants me to do that, yes, but, I mean, is there some problem with that?
No, I didn't mean to express a concern other than if we liquidate that holding, the 9%, then we will be back out in a very low interest rate environment with that, all that principal. And the yield that we are now enjoying, and prudently so, is providing for the operations of this town. So it's a trade-off. You can take a very conservative approach and say liquidate them all, and then take a gain. There potentially could be a gain there, because the interest rates that they are presently paying are higher than market right now, so there may be a premium attached with those. So there could be an overall gain, likely that there would be now that the President has signed the housing bill, so that there's a line of credit behind these investments for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And the caveat, of course, is now we'd have quite a large infusion of cash, approximately $7 or $8 million, that we'd be back out in the market investing in very low yielding investments. And those would be then permanent members of our portfolio for a while. So that is one risk. And so what we recommended a couple months ago was, why don't we just take a in-between approach, which is we hold these, and as they mature, we do not reinvest in Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae, and more of a gradual repositioning of the portfolio. But I don't have a crystal ball either, and I'm not trying to say that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would never fail. I don't want council to believe that that is a certainty. I could never say that.
I'm going to look to Mr. Larson first, and then Mr. Wasserman. Mr. Larson.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, staff believes the action of Congress and the President in the last week and a half have basically validated the position and recommendation staff had previously provided, that the best strategy at this time was to hold these instruments until we see a sign of loss or threat to maintain our current issuance returns, which are already declining over the last 3 months. For these reports in front of you, our weighted average interest return was 3.95, down to 3.81, down to 3.65. We do see the impacts of those investment trends on our portfolio, and the federal action seems to have backed up the prior faith and confidence of our investors in these tools. We're not compounding our risk by any further acquisitions, and in fact our risk is getting smaller as they eventually mature over time. The notion of having discretion for staff and the treasurer to pursue a stop-loss sale, if at some point that basically would be a delegation to staff, that if we see the entire portfolio at risk as a whole, that we would have discretion to act at that time. I think that would be prudent action and authority to give the finance director and the treasurer to take those steps should we see a turn of events that warrants it.
Mr. Washman, did you have anything?
Thank you. Yes, I did. So the people understand what our finance director said. They very wisely invested money a long time ago in instruments that are paying 9%, and we're using that revenue for the operations of the town. And to change from a 9% yielding entity to a 3% or 3.5%, we're going to lose 6% of revenue on those monies that are invested in those 9% things. And what you've been doing as they matured and reinvesting in other instruments, I think is wonderful. I think it's the right direction. When I was suggesting the sell stop, I think ties into what the manager just said. And your assets are worth X, and maybe 10% below that is where we bought into them. And if you place a sell stop, so if they drop to that, then they're executed. Ultimately, we're going to have to move from 9% to 3% anyway, because that's what the market is. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate you're trying to delay that loss of 6% on just those 9% of assets that we're talking about. I mean, overall percentage-wise, it's a very small number. I'm just trying to to think of some way that might help protect the principal, the body of the entity. But if what you're saying is when they drop down, all of a sudden, you'll say, okay, go, place the order, sell, that's fine. I just thought put something in place to protect that. But I just wanted the public to understand, we're talking about the difference between 9% and 3% on only 9% of the portfolio assets, and only until they mature. Some of those items, it could only be another year, correct?
Correct. One suggestion I was going to make is as the community may be aware that the elected treasurer's office will be joining the finance area November 1st, I believe, November 1st, if I'm correct about that. And I think as we approach, I think now with this firm new line of credit that the U.S. Congress or the President has approved being available to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, I don't see an immediate panic of sellers. I haven't heard much liquidation occurring across the country. And I think we could, as we amalgamate our efforts with finance and the treasurer, maybe this fall take another relook at this and see if there is a mechanism we can recommend to council that would provide some sort of stop loss if we see X percent of market value decline on those 18 investments beyond a level that we're comfortable with. We have orders to sell, and that might be a good compromise that we could recommend to council.
Mr. Glickman.
I appreciate Mr. Wasserman's analysis, and I very much appreciate Mr. Conway's analysis of that analysis. My concern is still in full force. As Mr. Wasserman pointed out, we're talking about a change. If we wait and hold on to these, eventually we're going to sell them, we get the money back, and then we reinvest in a market where we're not getting 9%, we're getting 3%. The question is, when do we do that? Do we wait for them to mature and do that, go from 9 to 3, or do we do it now and take the early hit in that change in interest? I'm recommending we take the early hit rather than the stop loss, and here's the reason. The federal government did not stand behind those securities. What they did is increase their line of credit to help those two agencies to survive. But if it should go south, it's going to go south very, very fast. And we could lose not the difference in interest between 9 and 3%, we could lose the principal. And if there's a stampede out, the value is going to drop like a rock. So, and I think that given the current tremendous uncertainty, and that's a very specific market, a historically very unusual situation. When I don't want to get into ideology, but I may be very socially liberal, but I'm very fiscally conservative. And on this issue, I'm very concerned. I think that it would be the safer course to take the rather minor hit of going from 3% to 9% to 3% on 9% of our investments now rather than later, and protect ourselves against the potential loss of the principal. That's where I stand.
A question of staff, what is the time frame when we would be, if we stay the course, what is the time frame in which these would be maturing and we would be getting rid of them in that fashion?
These investments have maturity dates anywhere from 1 to 4 years out from this date forward. So of that 21 investments, it's various dates, anywhere from 1 to 4 years out from today.
All right, at this point, I'm going to ask the council, we have a simple recommendation, which is to accept the reports as attached. I would like us to deal with that issue, and then if any council person wants a motion after that, that is fine. We'll consider it at that point. So I have a motion to accept the reports as attached.
I'll second that.
All right, it's my motion, seconded by Mr. Glickman. Discussion, hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Do we have any other motions?
Thank you. I'm going to move that we sell those securities now at market value and reinvest them.
Do I have a second? I'm thinking about this one too, Mr. Glickman. I'm going to second his motion. And I do understand and hear what staff is saying, but what gave me the greatest pause was the 1 to 4 years in which these would be maturing. So we have a motion and a second. Do we have discussion? Mr. Wasserman.
Thank you. I must confess to, on this item number 1, reading it as something to approve, a council agenda report, rather than doing a financial analysis of it. The problem I have is that I don't know how many dollars difference we're talking about. I don't know what the risk-reward difference is here, Mr. Conway and Mr. Larson. And I don't like making a decision from what now is amounting to like a desk item for me. I appreciate the explanation that was sent out previously and the fact that we've entrusted ourselves in financial experts' hands, and I agree with you entirely. Things have improved a whole lot better than 30 days ago. Is there by any chance, through the chair, if I can ask a question of staff, Madam Mayor, is there by, you say 9%, I'm pretty good with numbers, but I don't know what that 9% equates to now. If we're talking 9 of the 76 million, so we're talking $6.5 million. I don't know how many dollars we're talking about in assets that you say mature in 1 to 4 years. I don't know how many of them mature in 1 year. I don't really know where to look and how to make an informed vote at this point. Is there any way you can help? I don't want to abstain, but I don't want to cast an uninformed vote. That's not me.
If I may make a recommendation, or at least try to answer Councilmember Wasserman's question, I think that one approach that might make some sense is for us, I don't think that there's going to be a panic in the next couple of weeks. I would recommend maybe we could take this 9% and 16% number, get a July 30, or get as most recent update as we can get on our market value and our holdings, and have the Finance Committee recommend a strategy that we could put on our consent calendar for our next meeting. I think that's very doable. Instead of trying to, I think that tonight I could just go through this report and look at each one individually, but I don't have the current market value. This was a June 30 market value, and we need to get a current market value. So I was reluctant to recommend that we sell tonight, because I'm not sure what our position is in terms of, do we have, is that now 18 out of 20, or, what's our position? Are we underwater or not? And I'm fairly positive we are not, but I just want to confirm that.
May I respond to that, please?
With current values.
Hold on. I'm going to jump in there. I seconded the motion because at the time I seconded it, my choices were Mr. Glickman's suggestion that we liquidate those holdings, or Mr. Conway's statement that we would have them for 1 to 4 years. Given those two choices, I preferred the motion's liquidation. I would also agree with Mr. Wasserman. I would like to have more information, and I would be willing to withdraw my second in favor of considering this again in 2 weeks. But what you're saying is you're going to take this to the Finance Committee and then you're going to bring it back before the Council in 2 weeks' time. I am not sure that that's realistic. Is it realistic? And I will ask this of staff.
Staff can accommodate that, I believe, but it's whether the Finance Committee can calendar it. But I think we could turn that around very quickly.
The Finance Committee meeting would have to be next Tuesday or Wednesday because of prior absences that we've been notified of, and then it would be turning around to a council report the following Thursday.
And that means
2 days later.
Right, and that means that part of your Finance Committee would not be able to do at least one of those days. And so your Finance Committee would have to look at her calendar to see if that's possible.
May I recommend that we would bring it forward at the next, as soon as possible, as a separate item
agendized for after we have had the Finance Committee review our holdings and our market position.
All right, so right now we have, I understand, well, we have the motion and a second. Further discussion. Mr. Brzezinski, did I see your hand up?
Yeah. This is not how we should do business. This is not how we should do business. I think that we have information in front of us that needs to be enhanced, but I am not one to say at this point, let's go with the worst-case scenario, jump on the liquidation bandwagon, and lead the charge for anyone else who wants to panic at this point to take us out of this financial market. I think it's bad business. I think it's irresponsible government. I think that, as far as I'm concerned, we have the guarantees that Washington has put in place. They're recent, and they're an attempt to solve a problem that was initiated a couple of weeks ago because of some statement that was made that indicated there might be a problem with Fannie Mae, and because of that, there was a bogus downturn in that asset. I think that's being corrected now. If you're following the market, if you're following what's happening out there in the financial community, it's pretty clear that much of what's happening now is psychologically based rather than based on good fiscal conceptualization. So my recommendation is that we ask the staff to give us more information, to proceed at a pace that will allow us to get that information so that it's thoroughly vetted, so that we have what's appropriate in front of us. And I do not, and I'm taking a risk now, I do not, as this council member, feel that in the next 2 weeks the sky will fall. I do believe that we continue in this very strange economic world to intervene at the federal level to make some corrections so that we protect ourselves from some major destruction of the financial markets. And with that in mind, I am not one who would support that motion, and I certainly hope that we can move beyond this tonight.
Ms. McNutt.
Yay, finally my turn. Just a procedural point that I was trying to get attention to make is that I hear rumors of a desk item which I have not seen, so I have no idea of what information, and the mayor hasn't seen it either. So just based on that alone, I don't think it's appropriate to take any action tonight, since some of us have information that others of us don't. But putting that aside, I agree that it's inappropriate to, on a whim, put aside a recommendation of our elected treasurer, our professional consulting firm, our staff, and to take action without really analyzing what the repercussions of that might be. So I do think it's prudent to look at in more depth, since there are some concerns about it and some questions, and to bring it back to council. But to just tonight say, oh my gosh, let's do this and have something that could have such grave consequences for our piggy bank, I think is totally inappropriate. So I would not be supporting that motion, and I'd really like to have the desk items on paper, just in case we don't check our email right before we skate out of the office.
Mr. Glickman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We do try to keep our council proceedings collegial. I don't appreciate words like whim or irresponsible. This is not the first time that I brought this matter before the council, so I didn't just bring it up. There has been an ongoing national, if not worldwide, concern about the financial stability of these markets. One can read the press one believes in, but the concern is very real and very valid. And since this is not the first but the second time that I brought this matter before the council, I'm not suggesting we're doing anything suddenly. I'm frustrated by our slow response to what I consider to be a very significant risk.
Further discussion? I am going to, based on what staff has said, I'm going to withdraw my second, and I will be looking for, or alternatively, I will be making a motion to bring this issue before us as soon as the Finance Committee reviews it. But I do want to say that I do consider it a concern. I don't think it's a bogus problem. I do not believe the federal government has given us a guarantee, but simply extended, I believe, a line of credit. So that does make me feel like I'm a little bit on shaky ground. And as I said, I was concerned about this 4-year window. But that being said, I would prefer to have it come back to us with the additional information, some of which was the information that Mr. Wasserman delineated. So we now have a motion without a second. Does anybody else want to second it? Seeing none, the motion dies for lack of second. Do I have another motion? Mr. Wasserman.
I'll be happy to rephrase what I believe you just said, and that is to ask staff to come back to us with detailed information on what these particular 9% of our portfolio that you've referenced on page 1 of our staff report, what that consists of. And for myself, I need to know what instruments they are, what maturity dates, interest rates, et cetera. We're not the experts. We should not design from the dais or finance from the dais or do anything else. And we hire people at very expensive salaries to do their job very competently. I guess you're not expensive if you're competent. I hadn't thought about that. Anyway, long story short, my motion, Madam Mayor, is to direct staff, specifically the finance director, finance department, whatever finance, to bring us back information in a timely manner so that we can be prepared and analyze ahead of time what it is that we'd like to do and what it is we're really talking about, and then go from there.
I will second that motion if we ask staff to bring this back to us after the Finance Committee meets on it. Is that okay with you, Mr. Wasserman?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And what I'm looking for is, what are we talking about? Define the investments, and then look at the ramifications of holding on to them, and then the benefit or the detriment of getting rid of them sooner rather than later. So that's what I'll be looking for. I want to see my risk-reward analysis. Further discussion, Mr. Przinski.
Yes, and as part of that, Madam Mayor, I would hope that the staff returns with a recommendation that we can use as part of our decision-making.
Yes, I would be looking for a recommendation and a reason for that recommendation. Mr. Wasserman.
Thank you. And for the benefit of those listening or watching that don't have our staff report, it says MBIA, which is the town's advisors, as well as most financial analysts, continue to believe the investments in the two agencies' senior debt are of the highest quality and should be held. So I think what we're asking is for some further clarification and detail as specifically which of all of these assets, maturity dates, interest rates, consists of this one particular area of 9% that we're concerned about.
Ms. McNutt.
Thank you. And when we refer to staff recommendations, I would like to see that from the consulting firm, from the treasurer, and from the finance department. And those may be different. And it would be helpful, because that's often the case on financial advice. It would be helpful if they are different to know why. And if they're all the same, that's 3 bodies of expert advice coming in the same way.
Mr. Larson?
Yes, 2 additional points of clarification. One, there is a potential council meeting on the 25th, which would provide another opportunity if we don't make the next council meeting with the Finance Committee. So when it comes back to you, could be any of your next 2 to 3 council meetings, depending on the Finance Committee schedule. Second, staff working with our advisors and treasurer has the discretion now, if we see any problems in the portfolio, to sell using the investment policies and guidelines you've already given us. So there's no direction needed for us to act in prudence to safeguard the town's assets as we deem best. based on the policies you've given us. So that exists already, and we will continue to act in that direction. And town staff will provide to the Finance Committee and the council the information requested, as well as a recommendation, including recommendations, if different, from NBIA and the treasurer, but that has not been the case to date. The recommendations of town staff, NBIA, and the treasurer have all been in alignment to date.
Thank you. Mr. Washman.
Thank you. Just very quickly to say congratulations to MBIA. You have us in assets earning 9%. Okay? Thank you very, very much for doing that.
I do want to clarify that for the
thing.
record. We do provide a full listing of all the current assets. If you go to the very last page of the staff report, but it's in financialese that I wouldn't expect members of the public to try to discern.
And my point, Mr. Manager, is still the same. Thank you very much for having us in the assets that you have us in, producing all the income that you do, allowing us to operate the town in the manner in which we do.
Mr. Wasserman's jealous. All right, further discussion.
Yeah.
Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you. We had agenda item 10 pulled. Those are the minutes of June 16th, 2008. Citizen Ray?
Long discussion. But I don't give up easy. And I want to state for the record that I continue to be disappointed in the work of the administrative clerk, okay, as far as the minutes go, all right? I make critical statements in depth that I do a lot of homework on, research, and in fact, on this matter, where she has put down here that I commented that I attended the council commission retreat and expressed disappointment in the council's relationship with the youth commission. That is such an absurd innuendo in terms of what the point I was trying to make. And in my life's experience, minutes are supposed to have integrity and honesty and reflect what the person said. And her minutes absolutely do not do that. She whitewashes anything that is particularly critical. Is that the American way? Hell no! So when, Mr. Larson, when is something positive going to happen? When will she change her ways and bring some honesty and integrity into the minute arena of this town? I'm so sick of it. I may quit and stay home. There's a big smile. So there you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a motion?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Brzezinski, seconded by Mr. Wasserman. I do have one thing, since we have it here on page 2. Under presentations, it says Mayor Barbara Spector presented Mary Ann Cook, etc. It should say presented commendations to Mary Ann Cook, etc. Further discussion? Okay, hearing none, I'm assuming the motion is to approve as with the suggested change. Discussion, hearing none, all in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, passes unanimously. All right, now we are on agenda item 11. This was pulled from the consent calendar by Ms. McNutt, so she has the pleasure of talking first.
Thank you. It was just a question and concern, which seems very minor after having spent so much time talking about millions of dollars, but I was wondering on the rationale for changing the approval from $25,000 to $50,000 for the town manager because of its potential for causing disruption in service delivery, if that really has been an issue. And I know that there's a lot of other cities listed there with higher spending limits, but their budgets are considerably higher too. So is that something, I mean, I've been happy with the 25, so is it really causing a problem? Do we really need to change that?
The $25,000 limit has been a legacy amount that has not been increased to reflect the current cost of delivering services. So we are finding that more and more of what I would say normal operating agreements, things like small maintenance agreements on photocopiers, all sorts of what I would say rather routine housekeeping type of agreements that are non-controversial. They still have to meet all of our bid requirements. If they're beyond $25,000, they have to have a formal bid. All that we haven't removed any of that, but we have allowed the town manager. We recommend just to keep more current with current costs. A $25,000 amount passed 20 years ago is significant. We have our neighbor, City of Campbell, as an example. They have their amount is $10,000, which is very low, but it was in a town ordinance that was adopted in 1959. That amount, I looked at it from a CPI perspective, and if we would have updated that just with the cost of living, that amount would be $84,000. So I was very comfortable with recommending this $50,000 amount, recognizing that we haven't looked at this in many years, and that since the city, there are many jurisdictions, because I did have data of the 400 cities in California, many that are smaller than Los Gatos that have 50,000. It isn't. We were using an average. I believe I refer to an average here of about 70,000 was the average approval limit for council. So we were just trying to streamline this is more of a streamlining recommendation than it is trying to increase the town manager's authority over, but we really wanted, and we feel that our recommendation is we get more bang for the buck in terms of staff effort and documentation and the effort that goes in just in our agenda process to focus on those agreements that really do require, I think, a higher level of public scrutiny, and 50,000 was a good threshold. An example would be our audit contract, which is 70,000 a year. That would still be brought forward to the council, where we, discuss our selection of our current audit firm and who our new recommended auditor might be, as an example. That would definitely probably fall over the 50 threshold. But we have other things like photocopier, townwide photocopier, where we go out to a bid and we may have a $31,000 contract. It's never come up to question in terms of why them. We've done our homework, and the manager can approve that. Under this new policy, that's our recommendation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Questions? Discussion? Is that, okay, that's not you raising your pen, okay? All right, then if I don't have questions or discussion, do I have a motion? Mr. Wasserman.
I'll make a motion to approve item number 11.
Second.
We have a motion by Mr. Wasserman, seconded by Mr. Glickman. Discussion. Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Passes unanimously. We are now at council matters. Do we have any council matters? Mr. Glickman.
Thank you very much. Yes, I have 5 council matters. The first one, as I made reference to at the beginning of the meeting, on consent item agenda 4, we adopted a resolution addressing a statewide issue. I would ask if I can get a second council member to support it, putting on our agenda a resolution in opposition to State Ballot Proposition 8 that concerns same-sex marriage. I believe that ballot initiative deprives many of our citizens of what the State Supreme Court has recognized as their rights. And I would hope that this council, and we don't take typically positions on foreign policy or major issues, but we do when they affect our citizens directly. And we found it was appropriate to address the budget issue. We found it was appropriate to, when the time came up, the Patriot Act. I would hope that we would take a position on this. So I will look to see if I can find another council member to put it on a future agenda for a resolution.
Do I have a second? I do not.
Okay.
There are 4 more.
I do. The second is an announcement. I will not seek another term in this council. It is our policy not to use council meetings to electioneer, so I'll simply make the announcement and not embellish it with reasons, but certainly I'll be available to answer questions after the meeting. Which leads me to one other item, actually 2. I said I wouldn't give reasons, but I will say this much, that I've served 2 terms on the council. I think 2 terms is enough. We are one of the very few cities that doesn't have term limits. And I have always opposed that, and it might have seemed a bit self-serving. But I've come to change my mind, and you can either call that being open-minded or flip-flopping, but now that it doesn't affect me one way or the other, I do think that the reason that other cities have recognized the need for term limits is the tremendous electoral power of incumbency. And I've always felt people should have the right to elect who they wish, but at the same time, democracy is a work in progress, and we discover what works well. So I would suggest that, and again, I'm going to look for another council member to put this on the agenda, that we consider term limits. I think it would be classier that the council did it rather than it be imposed on us. So can I find another council member who would like to discuss this at a future meeting?
Do we have another person to second a agendized term limits?
Okay.
Do not. I'm sorry. Just make that.
I guess it's a legal question. Is in fact that something that a council can decide, or does it need to go for at least an advisory vote to the electorate?
That's a good question. I think in a general law city, the council can adopt an ordinance that sets term limits. I haven't researched the question, so I'm speaking off the top, but I believe you can.
So based on the assumption that we could, do I have a second to put this on the agenda? Ms. McDutt.
I will not second, and the reason is I don't think that, where are we, 3 months before an election is the time to talk about this. If we're going to talk about it, I think it would need to be in 2009, so it doesn't become an election issue.
And I would certainly have no problem suggesting it be discussed at that time. I was just looking for somebody to agree it should be on our agenda at some point.
Hearing no one, anything else, Mr. Glickman?
Yes, thank you very much. This concerns my role as your representative to the Valley Transportation Authority. I've served as your representative to the Policy Advisory Committee of that authority for the past 4 years. I was chair last year. And this year I was asked by the VTA board to serve on its Governance Advisory Committee. And I think you may have read about that in this week's paper. Simply put, by law, the VTA is governed by a 12-member board of directors. There's 5 members from Group 1, which is the city of San Jose, 3 from Group 2, which is Los Altos, Hills, Mountain View, Palo Alto, Santa Clara, and Sunnyvale, and then 1 member from our group, which is Campbell, Cupertino, Los Gatos, Monte Sereno, and Saratoga, and then 1 member from Gilroy, and then there are 2 county supervisors. There have been significant problems with the board given that governance structure. They were identified in a report by the Hay Group, which was a group of advisors who were hired by the VTA to analyze pretty much the entire structure and recommended that governance structure be changed. The VTA board put together a governance committee to advise them on that. There were 2 board members on it, Mr. Cassis and Mr. Sellers. They invited myself, Mr. Moylan from Sunnyvale, a couple of members of the Citizens Advisory Committee, including Ms. Okazumi from Palo Alto, and Norm Klein, who was the previous mayor of Saratoga. And that advisory group came up with the following suggestion, that the 5 members appointed from the non-San Jose cities be selected by the representatives to the Policy Advisory Committee of the non-San Jose cities, simply because these folks have had the ability to observe their colleagues in action. Currently, our member to the board is chosen by what we call our city grouping. And there have been some fairly significant problems with that, not identifying any particular city grouping, but a note was taken that those representatives, not infrequently, rather than taking a regional perspective, more use their position on the board to support local issues. And also that their term on the board was too short. We have adopted, and the VTA board has adopted some of the recommendations, but hasn't addressed the mechanism by which the 5 members of the non-San Jose cities are selected, because the law says that's up to the cities. Well, we're one of those cities. So it would be my recommendation as a member of that governance committee to this council that we support the recommendation of the governance committee and have the 5 members of the non-San Jose cities selected by a population-weighted proportional vote among their cast by those cities' representatives to the VTA's Policy Advisory Committee. So that would be my recommendation to this council in terms of that specific issue.
Question. Quite frankly, you were very articulate, but I can't tell you in all honesty I followed everything that was being said. And are you looking for this item to be agendized, or are you looking for...
It would need to be, because we'd have to take a voted position on it. So again, that's exactly what I'm looking for, is for it to be agendized.
All right.
I'm sorry for the long introduction.
Thank you. Is there a second to put this on the agenda? All right. I will second it to put it on the agenda.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. Lastly, and I approach this with some temerity and sensitivity. I had mentioned earlier that we don't electioneer from the dais. And some incidents occurred, some events occurred recently which troubled me. And I'll simply speak to them and say that it's entirely possible that my perception was not accurate, but nonetheless I saw it as troubling. A few weeks ago, a number of weeks ago, I was asked to sign a commendation for somebody, which we kind of do as pro forma. And there was a time when I had caused some controversy on this council by not signing commendations for Eagle Scouts because I was troubled by the Boy Scouts' very, very discriminatory policy on sexual orientation. And after consulting with a number of members of the community, and not because I was afraid that people wouldn't elect me if I didn't take the right position, but because I was sensitive to the impact on the young people, I said, all right, look, if the young person in question had done something to benefit the town, I'll commend them for that, and I'll not look too much at the context. The problem I had with this particular commendation, or the question I had, was that we seemed to be commending somebody who hadn't, at least as I looked at it, had done very commendable things, but not for Los Gatos. I said, well, okay, so I wonder why we're doing this. And then, but I sort of overturned my own policy and said, I'll sign the commendation anyway. He's a nice young person. And then a few weeks later, that very same person led our Pledge of Allegiance, and then a picture of that appeared on a campaign website. And that, to me, raised the concern or the appearance of what I had mentioned before. It looked a little bit like electioneering from the dais. It may not have been that intention. But it troubled me, and I just thought I'd bring it to the council's attention. Thank you.
Anything further? Anyone else on council matters? Manager matters.
Given this is our first meeting after recess, I'll keep it short. 2 two items I wanted to bring to the council's attention. One is just the staff's absolute trust and faith in the ethics and integrity of our clerk administrator, the prior comments notwithstanding. And second, the issue of the Los Gatos Community Hospital continues to be one before this community, and staff is planning to bring forward for council consideration at your next regularly scheduled meeting resolution of potential town interest in that matter. Staff's comment to date has been that it is in keeping with the existing general plan and zoning for that site that a hospital continue to operate to serve the residents of Los Gatos and the broader community, and that's in keeping with past council action and practice and is what staff supports. Any use of that site as a residential opportunity would require both general plan and zoning action, and would likely need to be considered as part of the general plan update with any change not possible till that process is concluded. So that will be coming back for your consideration at your next meeting.
And the mayor has concurred with putting that on the agenda as soon as possible. And I just want to say that I'm going to be adjourning this meeting in memory of Ruth Furziger, who passed away last week, and who was part of the KCAT crew here at the town hall, and who was partially responsible for our recordings of our council meetings. I also want to extend my special condolences to Jim Deflefsen, who worked with her and who continues to work with her without her this evening, and who I know misses her very much. So that being said, I adjourn the meeting.